A young girl went outside in front of her home, waiting for her father to return from the nearby store with groceries, and suddenly vanished without a trace. Her family immediately sought help from the police, and from the very beginning, the investigation turned into something more akin to the plot of a thrilling detective story rather than an ordinary incident, due to a unique sequence of convoluted clues and events that are rarely encountered in reality. Jessica Knott was born on June 22, 1986, in a suburban neighborhood of Orlando, Florida, surrounded by the care of an older brother, a younger sister, and loving parents. Her father made a living in construction and often went on business trips to other states for several days, leaving the children under their mother's supervision. Jessica was an energetic and cheerful girl who loved spending time playing with friends outside, amusing herself with her brother and sister, and also showed tender feelings towards animals. On April 5, 1996, her 9th birthday, Jessica's family planned to visit her father's parents for the Easter celebration. While her father went out to shop for the holiday and her mother was packing for the trip, Jessica returned from school with other children. Soon she asked her mother for permission to go out to the yard to wait for her father, expected back any minute with the holiday groceries. The mother allowed her daughter to play outside, warning her not to leave the yard. The residential complex, set back from the main road and surrounded by trees on all sides, seemed like a safe place, so concerns for the daughter's safety did not seem warranted. Jessica and her friends often played there without adult supervision. A few hours after 6 p.m., when the father returned and asked his wife about the girl's whereabouts, the wife was surprised, as Jessica was supposed to be waiting for him in the yard. He said he didn't find her there, and together they began to search the area to no avail. Deciding to ask the neighbors, they learned that one of them had seen the girl sitting on a bench reading a book. But this did not help find her. With darkness setting in and no information on their daughter's whereabouts, the parents called the police. The officers arrived and began searching and questioning neighbors, without result. Expanding the search area beyond the complex, they continued for several hours until a call came into the station. Significant noise was heard on the other end of the line, making it difficult for the dispatcher to understand the caller's words. A man's voice announced that the missing girl would be found near a water tower, a few kilometers from her home. Immediately heading to the specified location, the police discovered a heartbreaking scene. The body of the girl peeking out of a black trash container situated a short distance from the road. It was hard to notice from the road, as the water tower was located in the shadow of a bridge, visible only from above. Near the body, several magazines and a children's mirror were found. Law enforcement quickly identified the body as belonging to Jessica Knott and handed it over for forensic examination. In the course of analyzing the incident, investigators directed their efforts to trace the source of the 911 call, convinced that the initiator was the murderer himself. They hoped to arrest the perpetrator by following his trail. However, they encountered a difficulty. It turned out that the call had been made from a public phone at a gas station, located not far from where the body was found, less than a kilometer away. When the police arrived at the phone, the criminal had already fled. Although detectives attempted to recover fingerprints from the device, the chances of success were slim. First, the phone had been used by many people, meaning there were numerous different prints. Second, it became clear that the killer likely wiped down the handset after the call. Experts concluded that the victim had been killed elsewhere, and then her body was transported to the water tower. This was supported by tracks on the ground near the building. Presumably, the killer removed the body, wrapped in a trash bag, from a vehicle and dragged it to the discovery site. Jessica was found wearing all her clothes except for one shoe, which was never found, neither in the bag nor near the incident site. The only significant piece of evidence at the crime scene was a tire track on the ground. Although the police could not definitively say it belonged to the murderer's vehicle, they still photographed it and made a cast. Forensic experts, after a thorough examination of the body, determined that the cause of death was asphyxiation, as indicated by marks on the victim's face and neck. Everything suggested that the killer strangled her, likely with his hands. Furthermore, remnants of a hamburger, presumably eaten about an hour before her death, were found in the girl's stomach. The victim's mother confirmed that she hadn't given her daughter anything like that on the day, leading the police to speculate that the criminal had offered her the food. The absence of signs of sexual violence made the murder motive mysterious, prompting the investigation to consider the girl's parents as potential suspects, since both lacked a reliable alibi at the time of disappearance. The mother claimed to be at home packing, and the father was at the store. But theoretically, they had the opportunity to commit the crime. Investigators sought to understand how the killer could have led Jessica away from her home yard unnoticed by any of the neighbors, and without any sounds of resistance, suggesting that the criminal might have been acquainted with the victim. This point reinforced the argument that the killer knew the victim. Specialists tried to clean up the audio from the phone call to distinguish the perpetrator's voice from the background noise, but without success so far. However, even amidst the noise, it was noticeable that the killer's voice sounded with a hint of sorrow and remorse, as if he genuinely regretted what he had done. This fact, along with the decision to call 911, raised questions about the criminal's motives. Perhaps he was either enjoying the game with the police or truly sought to atone for his deed in some way. Since his voice carried sadness, investigators leaned towards the latter theory. During the further investigation, police inspected Jessica's father's car, where they discovered something intriguing: a bag containing black trash bags similar to the one in which the body was found. Nevertheless, an expert who analyzed the bag from the crime scene quickly determined that it did not match those found in the father's car and belonged to a different pack of trash bags. This allowed the father to be temporarily excluded from the list of suspects and directed efforts towards searching for other potential culprits. Forensic experts conducted a detailed examination of the clothing and body of the deceased for important traces, revealing several key points. Notably, they discovered an abundant amount of dog hair, which was odd since Jessica did not have a pet, suggesting that the dog might have belonged to the perpetrator. Additionally, a human hair belonging to an unidentified white male was found on the body, the analysis of which to obtain a DNA profile would take some time. 2 different types of foreign fibers were also found on the victim's clothing. After analyzing their structure, experts suggested that one type could have originated from car seat upholstery and the other from carpeting, supporting the theory that Jessica was killed elsewhere and then transported to the location where her body was found in a vehicle. Regarding the dog hair, forensic scientists decided to identify its breed using the FBI's specialized database, which contains microscopic images of fur from various dog breeds. The creation of such a database was motivated by the fact that animal hairs often become crucial evidence in criminal investigations, helping to solve many cases. Experts began a meticulous comparison of the found fur with data from the specialized database, dismissing non-matching samples. Eventually, they concluded that the fur found on the victim's clothing belonged to a Shar-Pei, indicating the possibility that the murderer owned such an animal. The fur could have ended up on Jessica's clothing, either in the perpetrator's car or in his home. According to the preliminary version of the investigation, the criminal might have lured the girl into his car under some pretext, taken her to McDonald's to buy a hamburger, and then brought her to his home, where the murder took place. Meanwhile, experts faced difficulties trying to enhance the quality of the recording of the criminal's call, after which they decided to seek help from NASA, hoping to use their advanced technologies for analyzing astronauts' audio recordings. The space agency provided its resources and managed to significantly improve the quality of the audio file. However, for a definitive comparison and confirmation of suspicions, investigators still needed a voice sample of the suspected murderer to match it with the voice on the enhanced audio recording of the call, which could conclusively confirm his involvement in the crime. Based on the guess that there must have been familiar relations between Jessica and her murderer, detectives offered the girl's mother to listen to the recording of the call in the hope that she could recognize the voice. Upon the first listening, the woman felt familiarity with the voice but could not recall to whom it belonged. However, upon the second listening, it suddenly became clear to her that the voice belonged to one of their neighbors, who often walked his brown Shar-Pei in the yard of the complex, whose name she didn't remember, but clarified this detail to the investigators. The police immediately identified the individual as 30-year-old James Crow. During the questioning of the complex's residents, Crowe mentioned that he had a brief conversation with Jessica that day while walking his dog and then left. A check revealed that Crowe had no criminal past. He lived with his wife, a professional nurse. Previously working as a truck driver, Crowe was unemployed at the time and spent a lot of time walking around the neighborhood with his Shar-Pei named Pumpkin. Law enforcement officials realized that the similarity of the voice on the recording and the suspect's ownership of a dog of the relevant breed were not sufficient grounds for arrest. Therefore, a warrant was obtained to search James Crowe's personal vehicle, during which they stumbled upon two interesting items. The first was a Happy Meal box found under the passenger seat, drawing attention due to the hamburger from McDonald's found in Jessica's stomach and Crowe's lack of children. The second item concerned the car's tires, which had been recently replaced with brand new ones, although the old tires were still serviceable. The police discovered that Crowe had replaced the tires on the day of Jessica's disappearance, leaving the old tires at the service station. This raised suspicions, and the police requested the service station's address. Upon arrival, they found only one of Crowe's old tires. Comparing the pattern of the remaining tire to the one found near where the body was discovered, detectives encountered a discrepancy. The patterns did not match, which became an unexpected turn in the investigation. Initially, law enforcement did not have absolute certainty that the tire track found at the crime scene belonged to the murderer's vehicle. It could have been left by a service vehicle that regularly visited the area. A further inspection of James's residence led to the discovery of a new detail, a box containing several rolls of trash bags identical in size and color to the one in which the victim's body was found. Such a coincidence could not even hint at evidence, so investigators faced the task of determining whether the bags were manufactured from the same batch, which seemed an unachievable task due to the lack of unique markings or features on the bags, considering the multitude of manufacturers of such products. Nevertheless, detectives found a way to show ingenuity in solving such a complex problem. They contacted Noel Roberts, a quality control specialist at the factory that produced the trash bags found in the suspect's home. Roberts was able to precisely identify the factory where the bags were manufactured, thanks to a unique code on the box containing the rolls. This code indicated production in Virginia, opening a new direction in the investigation and providing investigators with an unexpected turn in attempting to link the bags to the suspect. The specialist shared that the bags include a minimal amount of metals, such as iron or titanium, varying depending on the color of the products. Due to the variety of the product's color palette, the factory regularly changes the composition of the materials used, and the proportion of metals combined with plastic changes almost every day. Such microscopic dosing is difficult to measure with absolute precision. This opened up the possibility of comparing the bags found at the suspect's home and at the crime scene for the presence of said impurities using X-ray fluorescence methodology, which could reveal the exact amount of metals in the plastic. After conducting the analysis, it was determined that the proportions of impurities in both sets of bags matched, indicating their production on the same day and belonging to the same batch. Moreover, during the manufacturing process, small debris falls onto the production lines, leaving fine streaks on the fabric that are visible without special instruments. These streaks, located on each product and creating a unique pattern for each batch of material, are caused by the constant movement, fallout, and renewal of trash particles on the belt. Such a pattern of streaks is only preserved on a limited length of fabric, allowing for the conclusion that two different bags were not just produced within the same batch, but also within hours of each other. Analyzing the bags from the suspect's home and from the site where the body was found, experts identified a match of the unique lines with astonishing accuracy. But the discoveries didn't end there. The experts shared an additional observation. During the process of rolling the products into rolls by the machine, the winding is not always perfectly uniform. Without close examination, these slight imperfections seem insignificant and the rolls appear neat. However, a detailed inspection of the edges of the bags reveals thin folds and irregularities, creating another unique pattern similar to the streaks. After further comparison, experts confirmed that the bags found at James's were identical to the one used to package the body. Gathering all the data, they concluded that the bag used to conceal the body was not only produced by the same company, but was manufactured within a span of no more than 17 boxes from those at James's home. This indicated a high likelihood that the criminal used a bag from a roll located in his residence. To these findings was added a comparison of fibers from Jessica's clothing with elements of the interior from the suspect's home, including carpeting and his car's seat upholstery. The analysis results showed the samples to be identical. Furthermore, an audio analysis expert conducted a comparison of the voice on the recorded phone call with James's voice and confirmed their match. Despite the significant efforts of the researchers, all the obtained data was classified as circumstantial evidence. However, the investigators had no doubt about James's involvement in the crime, leading to his arrest. The prosecution stated its intention to seek the death penalty, although Crowe continued to deny his guilt. The upcoming trial was based on the investigation's theory that James, spending a lot of time with his dog outdoors, was well acquainted with the local children who loved to play with his pet, Pumpkin. This made it easier for him to establish trust with the children, including Jessica. According to the police's reconstruction of events, on that fateful day, James saw Jessica sitting alone on a bench during a walk with his dog. He struck up a conversation with her and offered to drive her to the nearest McDonald's, promising to treat her to hamburgers. The girl accepted the offer. After visiting the establishment, it is presumed he brought her back to the residential complex and invited her into his apartment, possibly under the pretext of playing with his dog Pumpkin while his wife was at work. The presence of carpet fibers from his living room indicated the girl's presence in his home on the day of her death. According to the investigation's theory, James might have attempted inappropriate actions towards the girl, but the situation spiraled out of control. According to medical experts, he strangled the victim while pressing hard on her face with his palm, likely in an attempt to silence her screams. In a state of panic following the girl's death, he wrapped her body in a trash bag for transport to his car without attracting the neighbors' attention. Then he drove a few kilometers and left the body near a water tower, called 911 from a nearby gas station, and returned home. During the preliminary hearing, James's defense team vigorously criticized the evidence base, pointing out that the circumstantial evidence presented could not serve as irrefutable proof of their client's guilt. Although the judge allowed this evidence for consideration, the attorneys emphasized that in cases discussing the possibility of a death sentence, the standards for evidence are particularly strict. And in James's case, the likelihood of such an outcome was questionable. As a result, the defense proposed a plea bargain to their client, which involved pleading guilty to a lesser charge that carried a sentence of 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole, in exchange for dropping the pursuit of the death penalty. In the summer of 1998, 2 years after the crime, James accepted the deal, under which he was not required to disclose the details of the crime. The suspect stated that his decision was motivated by a desire to spare the victim's family the ordeal of a prolonged trial. The prosecution believed that his actions, including the 911 call, might indicate genuine remorse, the goals of which remained unclear to the end. The only logical explanation in this scenario was that James sincerely wanted to alleviate his guilt for such a heinous crime. Jessica's parents were not pleased with this deal, as they had hoped for a death sentence. They also wanted the murderer to confess, but James remained silent. Nevertheless, he was not destined to serve out his term. The man passed away in November 2011 due to health issues at the age of 49, taking the details and motives of his crime to the grave. It's worth noting the truly unique work of experts and detectives in Jessica's case. The amount of information they managed to obtain from analyzing ordinary trash bags surprised even the judge, who had never encountered such a thing throughout his career. Despite this, he acknowledged that all these findings, taken together, would indeed have significant weight if the case had gone to trial. On the eve of Christmas, a little girl went to her room and mysteriously disappeared into the night. This incident immediately caught the attention of the public, and the search operation involved more than 3,000 people. Meanwhile, detectives discovered several astonishing details that ultimately helped them solve this high-profile case. Sarah Foxwell was born on May 18, 1998, in Salisbury, Maryland, USA, and grew up in a large family with 2 sisters and 4 brothers. Additionally, her mother had 3 more children from a previous marriage. Sarah's parents eventually separated, leaving her mother in a difficult position as she faced the challenge of caring for and providing for all the children alone, which meant she had to work extensively. As a result, the children often lived with relatives. Sarah was not only the middle daughter by age, but also the most cheerful child in the family, always trying to mediate her siblings' quarrels, and she was often successful. In December 2009, when Sarah turned 11, she temporarily moved to live with her aunt, grandmother, and grandfather, as her mother took on extra shifts at work in anticipation of Christmas, hoping to buy gifts for each of the children. Sarah's aunt lived on the outskirts of Salisbury in a spacious farmhouse that was appealing to the children. The house was located on a large plot of land, providing them with virtually unlimited entertainment opportunities. December 22nd was a fairly ordinary day, with only 3 days left until Christmas, and the children were in a jubilant mood, running around and having fun at the house. Pizza was ordered for dinner, and by 9 in the evening, they were getting ready for bed. Sarah shared a room with Emma, her 6-year-old sister, who was at the far end of the hallway next to the back door. After a short conversation, they fell asleep. The next morning, Sarah's grandfather woke up first and went to wake the children. Upon entering Sarah and Emma's room, he found only the younger girl. Thinking Sarah had already woken up, he began to search for her throughout the house but could not find her. After informing her aunt, they began searching every nook and cranny together. Realizing Sarah was not in the house, the aunt speculated that she might have gone outside to play in the freshly fallen snow. However, it quickly became clear that Sarah's shoes and jacket were still at home. The aunt's attention was drawn to Sarah's toothbrush, which was missing from its usual place in the bathroom. After inspecting the surrounding area and not finding the girl, the aunt decided to contact Sarah's mother, who arrived immediately, and they sought help from the police. The police responded promptly to the call and began a detailed inspection of Sarah's aunt's home. She shared that she had a habit of thoroughly checking every night before bed that all doors and windows were locked. She had done so again the previous evening. However, despite a thorough search, no traces of Sarah were found. Given the disappearance of her toothbrush, the authorities immediately suspected abduction as one of the main theories of the incident and soon stumbled upon additional confirmation of this theory. The police decided to double-check that all exits from the house were indeed securely locked. On approaching the back door, next to where Sarah's room was located, it turned out that the door opened easily when tried. Her aunt claimed that the door had been locked the evening before and had not been opened since. However, she suddenly remembered there was a spare key near the door from the street. Urgently checking its usual place, she was horrified to find it missing, which further strengthened the kidnapping theory, suggesting that the intruder was aware of the key's location and probably had close ties to the family. This hunch was further supported by the fact that on the night of Sarah's disappearance, the family dog, which usually barks loudly at strangers, remained quiet, making no alarm noises. Reacting to the information received, the investigative team immediately organized an extensive search effort. Word of Sarah's disappearance quickly spread to the surrounding neighborhoods, prompting a massive response from citizens willing to support the search effort. The sheriff enlisted the help of the media, encouraging everyone to check their neighborhoods for finds that could indicate evidence of a crime. Dozens of police officers were involved, not only from the local department, but officers from neighboring communities and even other states joined the operation. The key objective was to find Sarah alive. Given that the girl's toothbrush had been taken, there was speculation that the kidnapper might have kept her in some sort of hiding place. This stimulated police teams to mobilize all resources in the search. The first important trace was found right outside the house: fresh car tire tracks in the snow, presumably belonging to the kidnapper's vehicle. Given that all of Sarah's warm clothes had been left at home, it was obvious that the intruder could not have taken her away on foot. During the investigation, Sarah's relatives were taken to the police station where an unexpected discovery was made. Sarah's 6-year-old sister, who shared a room with her, secretly informed her grandmother of the secret. She had seen the man who had taken Sarah away. According to the little girl, she was awakened by the man's conversations with her sister. Not understanding what was happening and gripped by fear, The girl decided to pretend to be asleep. A while later, she noticed the man leaving the room with Sarah. This story shocked her relatives, but what happened next was even more shocking. Emma said she recognized the man. He turned out to be Mr. Tommy. The adults immediately realized who they were talking about. It was 30-year-old Thomas Lex, Aunt Sarah's ex-boyfriend. They'd broken up a few months ago, but until then the man had spent time at her house and all the kids knew him well. But the police knew Thomas even better, as he had an impressive criminal history. Over the years, he had come to their attention for crimes involving the abuse of women and girls. He first went behind bars at the age of 18, then Thomas abused a 12-year-old girl and received 4 years in prison. However, he was soon released early. Later, the man was sentenced to 7 years in prison for abusing another minor. However, for some reason, he was again released early after only 6 months for good behavior, and he was free. Shortly thereafter, he received another 6 months for abusing another girl. He also attempted to assault another girl on the very day his wife came home with his newborn daughter from the hospital. That wife later divorced him and obtained a restraining order against him because he had threatened to kill her and their daughter. Another incident occurred after a woman and her young daughter moved into the same street with him. The girl and her friend were sitting on the porch of her house, and at one point Thomas approached them. He told one of them that he had been watching her play in the yard and called her wild. He then grabbed a branch and started hitting her on her buttocks. The girl ran home and told her mom what had happened. The woman spotted Thomas through the window and realized she had already seen his face before she moved. She went to the rapist registry, registered in her new neighborhood, and Thomas's picture was there. The mother contacted the police and the case went to court. However, Thomas managed to get away with it. Before the trial began, the wife was asked not to mention the fact that Thomas was on the rapist register and had a previous conviction for abuse. This request was due to concerns that such disclosures could bias the court and, as a result, lead to Thomas being wrongly convicted. A few months before Sarah disappeared, Thomas was again the focus of law enforcement attention. He broke into the 24-year-old woman's bedroom at night, stripped, and began masturbating next to her bed. He was arrested, but after posting bail, he was released pending trial. Thomas was able to hide his criminal past acts from his Aunt Sarah, but when she did find out about them, he convinced her that all the charges against him were false and that he was in fact innocent of the crimes he was accused of. All these facts left detectives in no doubt that Thomas was the one involved in Sarah's abduction. Her relatives also noted that Thomas had shown an unusually heightened attention to Sarah during the period of his relationship with her aunt, which in light of subsequent events took on disturbing contours. Officers quickly went to Thomas's residence to interview him. He was residing nearby in a shed on his parents' property. After the interview, investigators were given permission to search the premises, where they found chaos and highly unsuitable living conditions, but no evidence linking it to Sarah's disappearance could be found. A large number of pornographic magazines and DVDs were found in the shed. During questioning, Thomas immediately began to deny any connection to the girl's disappearance, claiming he was trying to fight his tendencies to commit crimes against young girls. He stated that when he was in a relationship with Sarah's aunt, he consciously avoided being alone with the children to avoid any unfounded accusations. After mentioning that Emma had seen him the night she disappeared, Thomas stated that this was not the first time the girl had spread far-fetched stories. The investigators didn't believe a word Thomas said, and their doubts were reinforced by his inappropriate behavior. While talking about 11-year-old Sarah's disappearance, he was constantly smiling and laughing. The sheriff suspected that Thomas thought his crime was perfect and was confident that the police would not be able to prove his guilt. Nevertheless, Thomas claimed to have an alibi for the time of the girl's disappearance, stating that he had spent that night at a bar with a friend until late at night. Law enforcement officers immediately began verifying the alibi Thomas provided, and to their surprise, it was confirmed. Thomas had indeed been spotted at the bar. However, a problem arose. He left the establishment around 1 in the morning, and his whereabouts remained unknown until 7 in the morning, even to his family. Analysis of his mobile phone revealed that that night, Thomas sent messages to several acquaintances, women, suggesting a meetup, but none agreed. Despite the detectives' efforts, they could not get Thomas to confess. Driven by the hope of finding the girl alive, investigators directed all resources to the search, during which the suspect's pickup truck was examined. Inside the vehicle, key evidence was found. Sarah's green toothbrush and a large lollipop, suggesting Thomas used the candy as a means to lure the girl into the vehicle. Furthermore, the tire tracks from the pickup perfectly matched the tracks in the snow outside Sarah's home on the night of her disappearance. Thomas claimed to the detectives that he had not visited that house for over a month, which only confirmed his deceit. In light of the suspect's continued denials, law enforcement decided to search for Sarah independently. Hundreds of officers and volunteers participated in the search, covering an extensive area around the girl's residence. Abandoned buildings, forested areas, ravines, and bodies of water were checked, and canine units along with service dogs tried to pick up the missing girl's trail. From the air, helicopters combed the area from the start of the search operation. The initiative garnered massive support among the citizens, who flocked to the police station to sign up as volunteers, despite the inclement weather and the onset of the holiday season. Unfortunately, the first day's search did not end in success, but the teams were not deterred and resumed their efforts with the first rays of the morning sun the next day. Throughout, the number of responsive citizens only grew, eventually involving up to 3,000 people. The sheriff even had to organize a headquarters based at a large baseball stadium, since the police department could not accommodate such a large number of participants. Interestingly, among the volunteers were both adults and children who distributed water, hot tea, and food to all participants. Everyone was eager to contribute, hoping their joint efforts would help find Sarah alive. Meanwhile, the investigation obtained its first key evidence directly linking Thomas to the girl's disappearance. After Thomas was brought to the police station, he was given a new set of clothes, and his personal items were sent for analysis in the laboratory. Experts found foreign DNA on the suspect's underwear and compared it to a sample taken from Sarah's personal items. The analysis showed a complete match of DNA, leading detectives to the grim conclusion that Thomas likely assaulted the girl. The second day of the search did not yield the desired results, and on Christmas morning, December 25th, thousands of people again gathered on the streets, not letting the holiday distract them from their mission. That same day, investigators received information about the last location of Thomas's phone, which had been pinged by several cell towers on the night of Sarah's disappearance, determining the approximate area of his presence. The area, almost on the state border and 14 kilometers from Sarah's aunt's home, was covered with dense forest and a network of narrow paths. Hundreds of volunteers carefully searched every corner, hoping for a Christmas miracle and that Sarah would be found alive. However, by evening, at about 4 o'clock, a police team found the girl's body on the ground, almost at the very edge of the state, a bitter reality against all hope. She was lying on her back, and her hands were twisted in such a way that they remained raised upwards, pointing towards the sky. When medical experts began to examine the body, they were in for an indescribable shock. Firstly, they confirmed that the girl had been subjected to violence. Secondly, they found traces of strangulation, but determined that the perpetrator had failed to kill her in this way. In the victim's lungs, experts discovered mud and concluded that she had been attempted to be drowned in a puddle. Apparently, at this time, the victim lost consciousness. After that, she received severe burns. According to investigators, the criminal left her lying in that forest for a while, went to get a canister of gasoline, and set the shack on fire. Traces of smoke were found in her lungs, indicating that at that moment, she was still alive. This also explained why the deceased's hands were raised and directed towards the sky, something that sometimes occurs when a person is exposed to fire. Such extreme cruelty shocked all participants in the case. Even detectives found it hard to believe that the girl had indeed been subjected to all these atrocities. However, now that they knew what had happened to Sarah, everyone wanted only one thing: to achieve the death penalty for Thomas. Although Thomas continued to deny his involvement in the crime, the evidence against him was overwhelming, especially after the discovery of the body. A thorough examination of his vehicle revealed Sarah's hair and fragments of her pajama fabric on the front seat, further confirming his involvement in her disappearance. Given all the evidence collected, Thomas's chances of acquittal seem minimal. The trial preparation took over a year, but it never reached its commencement. In early 2011, the prosecution offered Thomas a plea deal, whereby he would plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole, thus avoiding the death penalty. Despite the gravity of his crime against Sarah, there were compelling reasons for this decision. One reason for the deal was that Sarah's younger sister would have had to repeatedly go through the traumatic process of testifying in front of her sister's killer, which could have inflicted further psychological harm on her. Additionally, there was a risk that if Thomas's defense could convince the court of the need for a lighter sentence, he might have been eligible for parole in the future. The terms of the deal eliminated such a possibility, ensuring that Thomas would never be released. Furthermore, the process was influenced by the state governor's opposition to the death penalty, which further reduced the likelihood of such an outcome for Thomas. As a result, he accepted the deal's terms and shared information with the detectives that they had already surmised. Thomas admitted that he had tricked the girl into leaving her home, then took her to a secluded location where he assaulted and killed her. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole and was sent to a maximum security prison. In the first days of his incarceration, he was attacked by another inmate who inflicted several serious wounds on him with a makeshift weapon during lunch. Nevertheless, Thomas survived, and the prison administration increased measures to protect him from other inmates seeking retribution. Sarah's case caused public outcry and indignation due to systemic failures that allowed Thomas to be released and continue committing crimes. In response, Maryland introduced the so-called Sarah's Law, according to which individuals convicted of sexual crimes against children are subjected to a minimum sentence of 15 years before the possibility of parole consideration can be evaluated. At the dawn of her career, a young woman set out on a morning jog that unexpectedly turned into a true disaster. This incident quickly made the front pages of all Irish media outlets and sparked a huge public outcry, stirring waves of indignation among many citizens. The investigators were burdened with an incredible weight of responsibility, and the conclusions drawn from their work shocked the public even more. It was incomprehensible to everyone how such an incredible event could occur. Aisling Murphy was born on July 6, 1998, in the small village of Bluebell in Ireland, where she grew up with an older brother and sister under the caring wing of her parents. The family had a passion for music, laying the foundation for Aisling's musical talent from a young age. She began playing the violin, gradually honing her skill, participating in school and community performances, playing in an orchestra, and eventually ranking among the top 5% of violinists in the country. Despite her deep passion for music, Aisling decided to pursue a different career, dreaming of becoming a teacher. She successfully graduated from college, obtained the necessary qualifications, and at 22 years old, in March 2021, she took up a position as a primary school teacher. From her very first days on the job, Aisling won the love and respect of her students and colleagues, approaching teaching with boundless enthusiasm and striving to make the educational process as engaging and interesting for children as possible. Moreover, Aisling and her beloved Ryan were floating plans for a wedding in the near future, also aiming to build their own home and start a family. Everything promised a prosperous and joyful future, filled with shared dreams and life optimism. However, in January 2022, their idyllic plans were abruptly disrupted. On January 12th, after the end of the school day, Aisling decided to take the opportunity for a jog since regular physical exercise played an important role in her life. She preferred a route along a scenic water canal flowing through the small town of Tullamore, which was popular among residents for dog walking, bike rides, or simply for relaxing in the fresh air. Before setting out for her jog, Aisling shared her plans with her mother, who somehow felt uneasy and suggested her daughter choose a different route. But Aisling confidently assured her mother of her safety, hugged her, and went on her jog around 3:15 p.m. Along the way, 2 women, also jogging past the canal, noticed a bicycle abandoned on the side of the road. Soon after, they heard sounds resembling muffled female screams coming from a wooded area on the left side of the path. Assuming someone might need help after falling off the bicycle, they rushed towards the sounds, intending to offer the necessary support. In this grim place, a far more sinister and terrifying scene unfolded before them. They found a young woman on the ground with a man standing over her, wielding a knife. It appeared the woman was trying to free herself, but the attacker held her firmly. Seeing witnesses to his crime, the man turned to them and brazenly demanded they leave. Neither of the women had their phones with them, depriving them of the opportunity to immediately call the police, and there was no one around who could help. Nonetheless, not losing courage, they began to scream at the attacker, demanding he release the victim. Realizing the criminal was unresponsive, they hurried to the nearest populated area to seek help. Soon, police and medical workers arrived at the scene, but it was already too late to save the young woman. By that time, the attacker had vanished, leaving his victim lifeless on the ground. First aid administered at the scene was unsuccessful, and Aisling Murphy was pronounced dead. The police quickly identified the deceased, next to whom her keys were found, leading investigators to conclude she had attempted to defend herself. Forensic experts discovered 11 stab wounds and signs of strangulation on Aisling's body, indicating blood loss as the cause of death. The news of the tragic murder of the young teacher instantly spread throughout the county, deeply shocking and disturbing the local community. The area previously considered safe and tranquil was suddenly overshadowed by this rare and horrifying crime, especially since Aisling was well known to many through her work at the local school. Law enforcement officers mobilized all their resources to capture the perpetrator. As a first step, they interviewed the two witnesses who had encountered the attacker face to face. These women provided a description of some of his physical features. Although they were too far away to see the attacker's face, they were able to accurately describe his clothing. Additionally, the police concluded that the bicycle found at the side of the road belonged to the attacker, suggesting he had left it to flee on foot. As part of the investigation, the bicycle was seized, and its images were circulated through the media in hopes of helping to identify its owner. The police also reviewed surveillance camera footage, hoping to spot the criminal on video. They indeed spotted a man on a bicycle, but the image quality was not sufficient to reveal any specific details useful to the case. A woman who had been walking along the canal 2 hours before the crime joined the investigation. She reported noticing a man on a similar bicycle following her. His slow pace and refusal to overtake her seemed odd to her. Though this information did not significantly advance the investigation, it suggested that the perpetrator might have been selecting his victim for some time before choosing Aisling. Experts analyzed information from the victim's fitness tracker, which allowed them to more accurately determine the timeline of events. She left her residence at 2:51 p.m., and half an hour later, the tracker began recording abnormal activity, likely indicating the moment of the attack. By 3:31 p.m., the device no longer recorded a heartbeat, marking the moment of Aisling's death. That evening, a 40-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of committing the crime, but details of his identity were not disclosed, only mentioning that the suspect was taken in for questioning. The following day, it was revealed that he was mistakenly suspected, and his involvement in the crime was ruled out. Despite this, the man's name and photo were circulated by the media, resulting in him becoming the target of insults and threats. The tragedy gained national resonance in Ireland by the second day after the incident, eliciting reactions from many political figures and drawing public attention. Thousands of people from various parts of the country gathered for memorial services, demanding that authorities find and punish the criminal. The police confirmed that none of Aisling's acquaintances were among the suspects, considering evidence that the perpetrator had been selecting his victim for a long time, patrolling on a bicycle along the canal. This information only heightened the community's concern, leading residents of the town and surrounding areas to avoid solitary walks, preferring group outings, and living in a state of constant fear of a possible new attack by the criminal. 5 days after the tragedy, an unforeseen event occurred. The police department's email inbox received a message confessing, "I killed Aisling Murphy. I am very sorry." Without delay, experts traced the sender's IP address and swiftly identified his identity. However, the man claimed he had no recollection of writing the letter, citing his mental disorders and alcohol dependence, which led to episodes of amnesia. He insisted on his innocence, and the police, after conducting a check, confirmed his words, finding no grounds to consider him involved in the murder. Subsequently, the investigation led to a discovery that became a key lead for the inquiry. During the autopsy, skin particles were found under the victim's nails, indicating her attempts to defend herself. DNA analysis of these samples showed they belonged to an unidentified man. Although the DNA profile of the perpetrator did not match any known to the police, this clue offered the possibility of definitively establishing his involvement in the crime upon further arrest and DNA comparison. Considering the possibility that Aisling might have seriously injured her attacker, investigators began calling hospitals in the area, hoping the criminal had sought medical assistance. These efforts were successful when a Dublin hospital, located about 100 kilometers from the scene, reported a man with cuts on his face and penetrating abdominal wounds. He sought help 2 days after the murder and could not provide doctors with a convincing explanation for his injuries. The medical staff noted that the injuries were severe enough to pose a threat to his health. Investigators went to the hospital to meet with 31-year-old Joseph Puszka to learn details of his story. Joseph recounted that he was attacked by an unknown person wearing a medical mask, making it impossible to remember any distinctive features. He noted that everything happened too quickly to catch any details or provide further information. Showing him a photo of Aisling, detectives tried to find out if he was familiar with the case, but Joseph replied that due to his limited English and lack of interest in news, he was not aware of this story. This account raised suspicions among investigators, who decided to delve deeper into Joseph's background. They discovered that he moved to Ireland from Slovakia in 2015 and worked as a construction worker, living with his wife and 5 children in a small village near the incident location. And having relatives in Dublin, Joseph came under police scrutiny. During the investigation, 2 of his homes and vehicles were searched, though information about the findings was not disclosed. A return visit to the hospital, where Joseph was admitted after surgery, took an unexpected turn. Despite his initial denial of involvement in the events at the canal, he suddenly changed his story, claiming he tried to protect Aisling from another man's attack who inflicted his wounds. This turn of events clearly raised doubts among detectives, as it contradicted the gathered evidence. The interrogation continued until Joseph made a sudden confession. "I did it. I killed. I am the murderer." This abrupt admission shocked the investigators, who immediately informed him of his arrest. Joseph was to spend several more days in the medical facility until his condition would allow for his transfer to the police station for further custody. Investigators assured that after his discharge, he would be arrested and given the opportunity to elaborate on his version of events during an official interrogation. However, Joseph did not wait for the official procedures and began to openly talk about the crime. He confessed that he lost control upon seeing an unfamiliar woman, aggressively attacked her, delivering multiple stabbings, and ultimately strangled her. He cited a sudden panic as the motive for his actions. In tears during his conversation with the police, Joseph inquired whether he faced a 10-year sentence and showed investigators 3 puncture wounds on his abdomen, the marks left by Aisling's keys. Apparently, she managed to hit him with such force that even a not particularly sharp object could penetrate the attacker's body. Joseph also provided a DNA sample, which perfectly matched the DNA found under Aisling's nails. As his hospital discharge awaited, Aisling's funeral took place, drawing national attention. The ceremony gathered Ireland's leading state officials, including the president, and crowds of people outside the church walls. Thousands of educational institutions across the country observed a moment of silence in memory of the deceased, and our students lined up on the street holding pictures of their beloved teacher. That same evening, Joseph was arrested and transferred to the courthouse, where the police had to protect him from an enraged crowd seeking justice and trying to reach the suspect. The next morning, the press service disclosed the methods that led to tracing Joseph, as well as new information previously undisclosed for the sake of the investigation. It turned out that on the day of the crime, Joseph pursued at least 4 women on his bicycle, as evidenced by surveillance camera recordings and the women's accounts of his strange behavior. One victim reported that after Joseph followed her on his bike for a while, he dismounted and headed in her direction. Seeing a car ahead, she ran towards it, prompting Joseph to retreat. Another woman mentioned that he rode past her, staring intently into her eyes. then turned around and began the chase. These testimonies only strengthened the theory that Joseph was intentionally seeking a victim, and these women escaped harm only due to the presence of bystanders. Although Joseph had not come to the attention of law enforcement either in Ireland or in his homeland until this point in court, he unexpectedly claimed to have lost memory regarding his confession in the hospital and denied the murder. Instead, he reverted to the story of trying to save the girl from another man's attack, who, according to him, inflicted his wounds. However, Joseph could not explain how his DNA ended up under Eisling's nails. Given his refusal to admit guilt, Joseph faced a lengthy trial process. The preparation dragged on for months, but considering the extensive evidence, there was almost no doubt about a guilty verdict being delivered. Yet the prosecution continued to meticulously work on the case. A year and a half after the tragic incident, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Law enforcement announced the arrest of 5 people connected to Joseph, his closest relatives and friends. They were charged with intentionally concealing information and creating obstacles for the investigation. Although the details of these arrests were not disclosed, all the detainees were eventually released. The trial of Joseph began on October 17, 2023. He had to spend the entire preceding period in isolation from other prisoners, as his life was under threat. Joseph's attorney insisted on his client's innocence and demanded the exclusion of the confession made in the hospital from the case files, arguing that Joseph was under the influence of strong medication affecting his consciousness. However, this argument was refuted by the prosecution's medical expert, who stated that Joseph had not received any medications that could induce such an effect. The defense claimed that Joseph was merely trying to help Aisling in a critical moment when the witnesses noticed him, trying to stop the bleeding. But the defense could not explain why Joseph then told passersby to leave, instead of calling for emergency medical help. An extensive body of evidence was collected against Joseph, including DNA analysis results. 2 witnesses identified him, and 4 other women reported his suspicious pursuit on a bicycle on the day of the crime. The prosecution presented a narrative in which Joseph was deliberately looking for a victim to attack, scouting for an object over several hours, which sounded much more convincing than the defense's attempts to justify his actions. As soon as Joseph saw Aisling, he aggressively attacked her. In response, Aisling put up a determined resistance. She actively defended herself, scratching the attacker's face, and managed to land 3 powerful blows with a key to his abdomen. Joseph, encountering unexpectedly strong resistance, panicked and inflicted 11 knife wounds on Aisling before strangling her. After committing the crime, he left the scene, leaving his bicycle behind. Due to the severity of his injuries, he was forced to seek medical help 2 days later. Joseph's trial lasted less than a month, and on November 9th, he was unanimously found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the court sessions, Joseph showed no signs of remorse for the murder. On the contrary, his behavior was defiant and mocking. After the verdict and transfer to a permanent detention facility, Joseph was immediately placed under 24-hour surveillance, as there was already a threat to his safety from other inmates who expressed a desire to meet him. Despite the clear evidence of his guilt, Joseph's relatives continued to insist on his innocence, and no charges were brought against them after the initial arrests. And it seems unlikely any will be after the verdict. Aisling's family expressed gratitude not only to the participants of the legal process and the police, but also to the entire nation for the immense support they experienced throughout the investigation. This level of solidarity proved invaluable to them. A little girl mysteriously vanished right from her bed. Her sister, with whom she shared the bed, shared an unusual story about how a mysterious stranger in an enchanting hat took the girl away. Despite some clues that the police managed to gather, the case remained unsolved for 35 years until the truth was finally unveiled, sparking a storm of public outrage. Jessica Gutierrez was born on December 3, 1981, in South Carolina, USA, and was the youngest child in the family, having 2 sisters and a brother. Following her parents' divorce soon after her birth, her mother, Debbie, faced the challenge of raising 4 children alone. They lived in the small town of Edmond, a few miles from the state capital, under circumstances where the mother had to provide for the family on her own, which was not easy. Nonetheless, despite the modest circumstances, The family maintained strong bonds of friendship and support. While Debbie worked, the older children looked after Jessica, and in her free time, the mother tried to find interesting activities for them. On June 5, 1986, a typical summer day, 4-year-old Jessica was playing in the yard with her siblings while their mother was busy with household chores. In the evenings, Jessica usually slept in the same bed as her mother since she was the youngest. But that day, her brother had an earache, and Debbie decided that he would sleep with her. Thus, Jessica ended up in a room with her sisters, where the older sister slept separately, and the younger one shared the bed with Jessica. At dawn the next day, Debbie woke up around 9 a.m. Rebecca, her 6-year-old daughter, who had slept with Jessica, approached her with a request to prepare a breakfast of cereal. Getting out of bed, the woman left the bedroom and immediately noticed alarming signs. The front door of the house, which she always locked at night, was wide open. The family dog, usually kept outside, was running around the house. A fallen curtain rod lay under the back window, and the protective mosquito net had been removed from the window. Approaching her daughter's room, Debbie did not find Jessica there. Papers were scattered on the floor. Asking the older children about their sister's whereabouts, she heard from Rebecca about the girl's absence and that a man in a magical hat with a beard had taken her. Thinking Rebecca was joking, Debbie began searching for Jessica, assuming she might have gone outside. Not finding her either outside or inside the house, the mother returned to her daughters and insisted that Rebecca tell her where her sister had disappeared. The girl consistently repeated her story about the man in the magical hat, causing Debbie to become distraught. In despair, she asked why Rebecca did not scream or call for help if she saw someone taking her younger sister. Eventually, Rebecca shared details of what happened. According to her, she woke up at night and saw a man in a wizard's hat with a beard carefully lifting the sleeping Jessica and leaving the room with her. Rebecca, who was only 6 years old, could not fully grasp the situation, became scared and hid under the blanket, thinking it was all just a terrible dream. After a short moment, she fell asleep again and did not tell her mother about the incident in the morning. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Debbie immediately contacted law enforcement. Upon arrival, police conducted a detailed inspection of the home and concluded that Jessica's abduction seemed quite likely, especially considering that the intrusion was apparently made through the guest window, from which the mosquito net had been removed. Upon closer inspection of the surroundings of the window, officers found a fingerprint on the glass, which was immediately sent for analysis, as well as a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts near the site of this presumed entry. Understanding that they were likely facing a case of abduction, detectives decided to install a recording device on Debbie's home phone in anticipation that the kidnapper might call with a ransom demand. Rebecca shared her story with the police again, this time clarifying that the intruder had turned off the fan and the nightlight before approaching their bed. Since a detailed description of the kidnapper's face could not be provided, the investigation focused on questioning Debbie, who was brought to the station for a more detailed account of the events of the previous day. During the conversation, Debbie speculated about who might be behind her daughter's disappearance. She recalled a recent breakup with a man she had been seeing for several months. According to her, he showed aggression and often consumed alcohol. She suspected that in light of their recent separation, he might have kidnapped her daughter as a form of revenge. Debbie called him directly from the police station, but the man denied any involvement in Jessica's disappearance. The police took steps to verify his alibi, but no evidence of his involvement in the crime was found. A theory involving Jessica's father was also checked, but it was discovered that he lived in another state and did not have the physical means to commit the abduction. While specialists checked the fingerprint found on the window glass through the FBI database, they found no matches, prompting law enforcement to refocus on a direct search for the missing child. The police conducted extensive search operations in the area surrounding Jessica's home, located on the edge of the town with agricultural lands stretching around its perimeter. Police officers thoroughly examined abandoned buildings, plantations, bodies of water, and other secluded places where the girl might be hiding. The next day, FBI agents joined the search, but no traces of Jessica were found. The distribution of flyers expanded to neighboring towns and across the state. The sheriff organized an aerial survey of the territory, but even these efforts yielded no results. Debbie was exhausted by worry and despair, staying at home with her 3 children and unable to join the search. She received information about the progress of the investigation from the police only sporadically. 2 days after the disappearance on Saturday, Debbie asked the sheriff about continuing the search over the weekend. The conversation was extremely emotional. Debbie expressed her dissatisfaction with the perceived inaction, to which the sheriff sharply responded, claiming that he had conducted searches all night and warned that further accusations could lead to the cessation of the search operation. Since Debbie's home phone continued to record all conversations, she preserved this conversation as evidence. With each passing day, Debbie lost more hope that her daughter would be found, believing the police efforts were insufficient. This situation lasted for many months until an unexpected turn occurred in the investigation. 10 weeks after the girl's mysterious disappearance, the police were faced with a wave of new crimes. A local resident broke into a private home, but the owner, armed, forced the intruder to flee. The criminal then took a van and headed to North Carolina, where he broke into a woman's home and committed violent acts against her. He was soon apprehended, and after his fingerprints were entered into the database, investigators found an exact match with the print found on Jessica's home window. The criminal was identified as 27-year-old Thomas McDowell. Upon learning of the match, Debbie immediately informed the police that McDowell was an acquaintance. She recalled that just a few months before Jessica's disappearance, she had hired him for construction work on her property. During his 2-day stay at her home, McDowell built a shed and repaired the porch. Interestingly, McDowell wore a beard and a tall cowboy hat, which could have led Rebecca, who saw the kidnapper only briefly and in the dark, to mistake his headgear for a wizard's hat, similar to those she had seen in cartoons. However, the police faced the problem of insufficient evidence to press charges. First, the absence of Jessica's body made it impossible to assert her death with certainty. Second, McDowell's fingerprints on the window could be explained by his work at Jessica's home, even though the likelihood of this seemed improbable. Upon examining the house, forensic experts noted that the fingerprint had not been exposed to external conditions, such as weather, that could have distorted it. Moreover, Debbie regularly cleaned the window where the print was found, as her children often came up to it, pressing their hands against it to speak to her, leaving marks that had to be removed. 6 months before the child's disappearance, Thomas McDowell had worked on the family's property, and by the time of the police's inspection of the scene, no other fingerprints besides his were discovered. This indicated that the man was unlikely to have left his print during the work. Debbie mentioned another important point. When Thomas was working for her, she accidentally locked herself out of the house, leaving the keys inside. To get back in, she had to climb through the same window McDowell had watched her through. However, all these arguments did not influence the police, and their opinion remained the same. There was not enough evidence against McDowell. In 1987, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for assaulting a woman in another home. Debbie was devastated by the authorities' refusal to charge McDowell with the kidnapping. That same year, McDowell's cellmate informed the police about Thomas confessing to committing a horrific crime. McDowell claimed he kidnapped the girl from her home in South Carolina, intending to molest her, but when she bit him, he killed her in a rage and dismembered her body with a machete, after which the remains were thrown into a field. When confronted by investigators, McDowell did not deny his actions and offered to give a confession in exchange for immunity, which the authorities found unacceptable. Learning that McDowell had avoided punishment, the cellmate wrote a letter to Debbie telling her everything. Disappointed by the police's inaction, Debbie began her own investigation. At one point, she found McDowell's abandoned car and inspected it, discovering threads and fabric fibers on one of the seats that matched the color of Jessica's pajamas. Despite this lead, the police did not give it proper attention, finding it odd that Debbie, without special equipment and forensic knowledge, could find such evidence. In 1987, another event occurred. Kansas police notified local detectives of a girl matching Jessica's description. Her mother immediately went there, but all hopes were dashed when she heard the child's voice from the corridor and realized it was not her daughter. In the years that followed, Debbie gave interviews criticizing the police's inaction and ignoring the obvious suspect, but it did not lead to significant changes. In 1990, Jessica's story was featured in a popular TV show about unsolved crimes, which prompted new leads, but all led to dead ends. A year later, Jessica became the first child in South Carolina for whom an age-progressed portrait was created. In the early 90s, this was an innovative technology potentially capable of helping identify missing persons as they aged. Nevertheless, the case remained stalled for many years. In 2007, 21 years after the disappearance, Jessica's mother again publicly accused the police of inaction, presenting to the press for the first time the recording of the conversation in which the sheriff talked about the possibility of ending the search. Journalists approached the sheriff, who stated that the investigation had never ceased over the years, and more officers had been assigned to the case after that incident. Debbie also expressed dissatisfaction with the failed attempts to involve other agencies in the investigation, which were each time blocked by the local prosecutor. That same year, a case review was conducted, confirming the lack of sufficient evidence to charge anyone, leaving the situation unchanged for the subsequent years. In 2014, events significantly impacted the local law enforcement system. The sheriff was convicted and removed from office for fraud and bribery, receiving a sentence of 1 year in prison. 2 years later, the prosecutor was arrested for driving under the influence, which led to a DUI with a subsequent hit and run, costing him a $1,000 fine and the loss of his position. In 2021, 35 years after Jessica's disappearance, Sheriff Jay Kuhn initiated the reopening of the investigation, seeking assistance from the FBI's Special Unit for Missing Children. 50 agents were deployed, who began the investigation from scratch, reviewing all available materials and seeking new leads. During the thorough analysis, the team not only confirmed the existence of evidence against Thomas McDowell, but also discovered new indirect evidence of his guilt. Relatives and acquaintances pointed out that immediately after Jessica's disappearance, McDowell changed his appearance, shaving off his beard and hair and abandoning his habit of wearing a cowboy hat, which he had always worn before. It was also noted that McDowell smoked the same brand of cigarettes that were found near Jessica's home. However, attempts to find DNA on the cigarette butts were unsuccessful, likely due to their destruction during the initial analysis in 1986, when forensic methods were not as advanced. These additional pieces of evidence, along with the fingerprint in the cellmate's testimony, were key in the decision to take the case to court. In January 2022, Thomas McDowell was arrested, marking a significant breakthrough in the long-stalled case. At the time, the 62-year-old man refused to admit guilt, leading to prolonged preparation for the trial, which lasted several years. The trial only began in January 2024. Thomas's defense sought to challenge the evidence, arguing that the fingerprint on the window could have been left during his work on the property. They also questioned whether Rebecca could have mistakenly identified a man in a wizard hat instead of a cowboy hat. However, experts called by the prosecution emphasized that the fingerprint was definitely fresh and would have disappeared or changed over time due to weather conditions. At the trial, a former inmate also testified, repeating the story Thomas had told in prison in 1987. The prosecution argued that a person from another state was unlikely to be aware of the case details. Moreover, Thomas had previously expressed a desire to confess to the crime, requesting full immunity from the police. The trial concluded on February 8th, and the jury unanimously found Thomas guilty. The 63-year-old man was sentenced to life in prison. For Debbie, who had been convinced of his involvement from the beginning, the case's conclusion brought mixed feelings. She felt satisfaction that the guilty party was finally punished, but regretted that the arrest could have been made 36 years earlier. This would have prevented the many years Thomas spent free before being held accountable. Nevertheless, Debbie still could not come to terms with the fact that her daughter's remains had never been found. Along with the new police team, she intends to continue the search, although the chances of finding them after 4 decades are slim. Love is often mistakenly equated with possession, while vitality and appeal are misconstrued as bad temper. Unfortunately, under certain circumstances, such misconceptions can lead to tragic outcomes, as was the case in the lives of the main characters of our story today. On Monday, July 3, 2012, in the peaceful small town of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, USA, karting mechanics with immense dedication were busy preparing their cars in their garages, while Frank Spencer's friend Joe had been unable to get in touch with his buddy since the start of the weekend. At this point, their team was halfway to a coveted victory in the racing series, and they had every chance of success. However, after recent competitions, problems began to arise with the cars, and Joe urgently needed advice. Therefore, he decided to head over to Frank's house since he wasn't answering calls and his mobile was turned off. On his way, Joe half-jokingly thought he hoped not to find his friend dead, yet had a grim premonition. Upon arriving in his car, Joe immediately felt alarm. The front door was ajar and bloody traces were visible at the doorstep. Joe's worst fears were confirmed. Inside, his best friend, a racer, lay on the floor lifeless. This once vibrant person now seemed as peaceful as never before. For a moment, John was paralyzed by shock, unable to even move, just staring silently at his friend, with the heavy realization that he would never be able to exchange a handshake with him again. An observer circled the body and noticed dried blood spilled from a bullet wound near the ear. Then the man dialed the emergency service number 911, reporting the horrific find. His friend had been murdered. He was certain of the culprit's identity. In 1997, Frank Spencer and his beloved Maria were passionately in love with each other. Their parents, disapproving of the relationship, tried to intervene for a long time, but the lovers did not relent. Eventually, they took decisive action, ran away from home and rented an apartment, seeking to escape the family scrutiny. Over time, their romance was accepted by relatives who realized that further objections would only worsen the situation and risked losing touch with the young couple. Maria and Frank soon got married, and they first had a son, then a daughter. After that, the young family moved into their own house, starting to create a cozy place for living. Frank worked tirelessly, striving to provide for his family with everything needed, working for the welfare of his loved ones, building a career, and developing his own business. These same values were passed down from generation to generation. Frank's father had managed his own business for many years, and upon retiring, passed the baton to his son, who proudly took on the responsibility of continuing the family business. Frank's friends noted that Maria exhibited a cool attitude towards family values and married life. In fact, her interest in the children was minimal. She seemed preoccupied with herself and rarely devoted time to domestic duties. Her primary interest was finances. Maria loved to spend money, which became one of the reasons for tension in the family. This, along with her almost complete indifference to raising the children, gradually led to the dissolution of the marriage. In 2006, the couple decided to divorce, with the initiative coming from Frank, who was tired of the endless arguments and emotional outbursts from his wife. Her behavior was so unstable that Frank seriously feared for the well-being of the children. The situation escalated after the decision to divorce, spawning even sharper conflicts. Frank insisted that the children stay with him, confident that Maria could not provide proper care for them. However, there were people in his circle who disagreed with his stance. His friend Ron believed it was important for the children to maintain connections with both parents and called for a compromise regarding custody, suggesting it be shared between the ex-spouses. Frank did not object to the children's meetings with their mother, but aimed to protect them from her short-sightedness and the potential threat she posed. Nonetheless, contrary to the wishes of her ex-husband, Maria sought sole custody of the children, hoping to secure significant alimony since she was unwilling to work. Due to issues related to the divorce and custody rights, fierce disputes often arose between Frank and Maria. These disagreements turned into constant clashes, especially when discussing the division of custody rights. Frank repeatedly resorted to calling the police to his home due to Maria's uncontrollable behavior, which manifested as aggression towards him and their children. In one incident in 2008, Maria was even arrested after instigating a fight with her former mother-in-law at one of the children's schools. Maria came to pick up her daughter, contrary to an agreement with her former mother-in-law, leading to a physical conflict. After the altercation, Maria drove away with her daughter in her car, forgetting to buckle her up. This fact was noticed by patrol officers, leading to legal troubles for Maria. She was charged with hooliganism, and moreover, Frank accused her of stalking. Despite Frank's confidence in the threat to their children's safety, the prosecutor, according to him, lacked sufficient evidence and witness statements to support these charges. Eventually, Maria was offered a plea deal. She admitted her guilt in hooliganism and stalking, but charges of creating a threat to her daughter's life were dropped. As a result, Maria was fined $600 for her misdemeanors. However, the punishment received did not lead the irresponsible mother to reconsider her actions. On the contrary, Maria became even more aggressive, especially towards her ex-husband. Since then, Frank's circle, including his friends and relatives, began to hear his complaints more frequently. He made revelations about Maria threatening and stalking him, unashamed in the presence of others. The situation escalated to such an extent that there were numerous witnesses who could confirm his words based on their own observations. Frank tried to maintain composure, aiming to resolve the conflict, and meticulously recorded all incidents to later present them as evidence to the police. He sought to resolve all issues as, in his opinion, Maria clearly did not know the limits of her actions. By 2009, the divorce process had not yet been finalized, despite 3 years having passed since the start of the divorce proceedings. Throughout this time, the children lived with their mother, but despite the problems with his ex-wife, Frank decided to move forward. During this period, he met a woman named Julie Den, whom he encountered through mutual friends, and soon serious relations developed between them. When Maria learned about Frank's new romance, the situation worsened. According to her claims, she was indifferent to Julie spending time with Frank, but the idea of another woman interacting with her children triggered a violent and painful reaction in her. Frank was convinced that Maria's accusations were baseless, as Julie always showed exceptional kindness to his children, behaving much warmer than their biological mother. He believed that the true reason behind her aggressive outbursts was jealousy, which only exacerbated the tension in the relationship with his ex-wife. The situation was further complicated by the release of Anthony Rocha Franklin, Maria's father, whose 5-year sentence for fraud was coming to an end. For Frank, Rocha's return to freedom was an extremely unwelcome turn of events, given his reputation as a particularly dangerous and aggressive man with a difficult character, traits many believed Maria had inherited. During this period, Frank's increased anxiety seemed almost paranoid, but not without reason. A few months after Rocha's release, criminals broke into the office of the company Frank managed. Although they did not take any valuable property, documents crucial for Maria in her pursuit of alimony disappeared from his personal office. She intended to use his business records to expose possible violations. At dawn following the incident, Frank received an unexpected call from Maria. Her message seemed absurd. She claimed to have found a package with his documents on her doorstep, lying there since the morning. No connection to the break-in and theft at Frank's office could be established. According to police statements, no traces that could point to a perpetrator were found. Nevertheless, Frank's friends and relatives were convinced that only 2 people were behind the action: his ex-wife Maria and her father Rocha, who had recently been released from prison. During the investigation, detectives questioned Maria as the main suspect, but failed to find evidence of her guilt. Ultimately, due to a lack of convincing evidence, the investigation was suspended. Despite this, due to pressure from law enforcement, Maria decided to hand over the found documents to her lawyer, who, in turn, deemed it necessary to return them to the owner. Presumably, Maria and her legal representative found no incriminating information in the documents that could be used against Frank. This incident remained unsolved and continues to raise questions for many, as it was clear that the crime was committed with someone's involvement. The lack of punishment for the culprits only contributed to the intensification of aggressive tendencies among those they encountered, creating an even more tense atmosphere. Following these events, Frank faced threats on the internet, regularly coming from his ex-wife. She repeatedly expressed her outrage through social media regarding the relationship of his new partner with their mutual children, displaying excessive jealousy and concerns for the children's welfare in Julie's presence. These online disputes continued until the winter of 2010. At this point, seemingly having reached his limit of patience, Frank turned to the police, reporting the threats he had received and providing the exchange of messages with his ex-wife so that law enforcement could independently assess Maria's behavior. She, in turn, claimed that her words were misinterpreted, asserting that she meant no threat, and her messages were merely the result of an emotional outburst and loss of composure during arguments with Frank. Consequently, her words should not have been interpreted as threats, considering that the text was written in a mild form, making it impossible to prove her guilt. While Frank and his partner Julie were planning a charming Caribbean trip in January 2011, Maria, upon learning of their intentions, began to actively interfere, bombarding Julie with messages and calls. She tried to convince her that Frank still felt attached to her and that romantic relations between them had not ceased even after the divorce. Maria orchestrated a fake meeting to confrontationally communicate with Julie, hoping to destroy their relationship. All of Julie's attempts to clarify to Maria that they wanted to be left alone were unsuccessful, and the situation worsened. One night, Frank's house became the site of a tragedy due to a fire outbreak. Neighbors and friends, seeing the flames, immediately rushed to the site, fearing Frank might be inside. Everyone was convinced of his demise, as the house was supposed to be safe and quiet at that time. Meanwhile, Maria, having arrived at the scene, watched the fire with undisguised joy, and then silently drove away without uttering a word. Fortunately for Frank, he was not in the house at the time of the fire. However, a dog belonging to one of the children of the estranged spouses perished in the fire, becoming the sole victim of the sad event. Frank again sought help from law enforcement, insisting that his ex-wife was behind the fire. He was seriously concerned, believing that the incident posed a real danger to both himself and his loved ones, given that his ex-wife had moved from threats to real actions. Despite his fears and previous appeals, law enforcement remained at their stance. There was insufficient evidence of arson, as it had been destroyed by the fire. Thus, the incident was recorded as an accident, adding yet another unresolved case to the Spencer dossier. To Frank's surprise, he was unable to secure protection from his ex-wife's harassment through police support, despite clear indications of her involvement. It felt as though local law enforcement might not be sufficiently interested in resolving his issue or even in collusion. However, one officer tried to initiate a criminal case and interview Maria as the main suspect. But since the fire department had already ruled the incident as accidental, any further attempts at investigation were blocked. Nonetheless, this officer continued to assert that the arson could not have been accidental, especially considering the prolonged conflict between Frank and his ex-wife. In response to the incident, Maria sent Frank a series of text messages in which she sarcastically and mockingly referred to what had happened, blaming him for ruining her life and calling the events well-deserved karma. She also expanded her threats, sending similar messages to Julie, warning that she would be the next target. Despite this, the police did not see her actions as grounds for charges, which only emboldened her and convinced her of her own impunity, prompting her to make open threats to both Frank and his new partner. Maria apparently did not intend to stop at words alone. Sometime after her messages, Julie's house was engulfed in flames. At that moment, Julie was at home and was forced to jump from the roof of her porch to escape. Although Julie did not sustain serious injuries, her property was destroyed by the fire and she was left homeless. The parallels between this event and the arson of Frank's house were obvious to both, especially considering that Julie's house was not completely destroyed but became uninhabitable. Frank and Julie hoped that evidence indicating arson would be found at the site of the fire. They also counted on closer police attention as the house was located in a different county. However, their expectations were not met. Even after extensive interaction with the victims, law enforcement found no sufficient grounds for investigation, declaring the fire an accidental event. Julie had to appeal to higher authorities to initiate a proper investigation by the police, which ultimately gave the case some momentum. As a result of intensified efforts, pyrotechnic elements likely used for arson were discovered in her garden. Among the foliage, one damaged specimen was found, and then a second, which most likely served as the source of ignition. Additionally, traces of gasoline were found on the steps leading to the house, strengthening suspicions of deliberate arson. After prolonged debates, authorities concluded that the fire was the result of intentional actions. Nevertheless, the investigation reached an impasse and the perpetrator was not identified. Both Frank and Julie unhesitatingly pointed to Maria, who had been pursuing her ex-husband for a long time. Moreover, just before the incident, she had clearly made threats related to fire. With the start of Frank's new relationship, Maria intensified her attempts at interference and threats, which became even more aggressive after her father's release from prison, creating the impression that they were acting together. Despite these circumstances and clear signs of stalking, police were unable to bring charges due to alleged lack of evidence. The situation continued to escalate, so by the summer of 2012, Frank and Julie decided to temporarily separate, hoping to mislead Maria and give her time to calm down. To lend their actions more credibility, the couple even published their story in the local press, coincidentally aligning with the conclusion of their divorce process. Unexpectedly, just a day after the publication, Frank was found lifeless. Relatives and close ones immediately suspected the ex-wife of involvement in Frank's death, considering that the divorce had been finalized just a day before the tragedy, and Maria had repeatedly expressed her displeasure with the breakup. Maria initially opposed the divorce, and their separation case turned out to be extremely complicated and protracted, with constant conflicts at every interaction. Ironically, it was Maria's bright and fiery nature that once attracted Frank, who himself possessed incredible energy and temperament, finding in her a reflection of himself. Initially, their union was a continuous complement to each other. However, over time, passions led to exhaustion and discord in the relationship. Yet the question remains, could these challenging relationships have reached a point where one of the partners resorted to extreme measures? Unraveling this mystery was up to the investigator. Upon arriving at the scene, law enforcement officers discovered extensive pools of blood in the deceased's home, surrounded by smudged tracks, indicating attempts to erase evidence. Among the evidence found was a clear shoe print on the floor, which, according to forensic analysis, matched the shoes typically worn by Maria's father. In the center of the kitchen on the floor, one yellow rubber glove was found, and another in the sink. DNA analysis of these gloves revealed the presence of Maria's skin particles, although friends of the deceased insisted she had not lived in the house for over a year, excluding the accidental presence of the gloves in the home. This evidence testified to the recent use of the gloves and pointed to a direct connection of both Maria and her father to the crime. Both suspects were arrested. The entire town was convinced that they were behind the brutal vendetta against Frank, aiming to see him dead. The long history of Maria's harassment, turning her ex-husband's life into a nightmare, and the arsons, which the locals also attributed to Maria and her father, only confirmed this theory. However, for the official presentation of charges, the police required irrefutable evidence, which was soon provided by the results of laboratory analyses and the conclusion of forensic experts. Frank died from injuries sustained from shots fired from two different types of weapons. According to the forensic medical experts' conclusion, the first shot was made with a shotgun as Frank approached the front door, possibly intending to open it. No traces of gunpowder were found on his clothing, indicating that the shooter was at a relatively long distance. The bullet pierced his arm and entered his chest, severing a critically important artery, leading to a fatal outcome. However, this was not the only injury. The police speculated that after the first shot wounded Frank, he was dragged into the house where the attacker made a control shot with a pistol to the head at close range. The presence of gunshot residue on the body confirmed this. It is believed that by that time, Frank was already dead, and the second shot was made as an expression of rage or revenge, showing deep hatred for the victim. All these details match Maria's profile, indicating that if Frank had not died from the first shot, the subsequent one would certainly have been fatal for him. The police theorized that Maria's father, Roca, was behind the shotgun shot, while his daughter Maria delivered the decisive blow, shooting Frank with a pistol inside the house. This act was the culmination of their joint actions. After Frank was dragged into the house and left on the floor, Maria fired the shot. Detectives also noted the disappearance of Frank's dog and car, which added additional questions to the investigation. As a result, it was decided to check the traffic camera recordings, and soon Frank's pickup was spotted on the highway, moving away from his home shortly after his death. Unfortunately, the quality of the recordings was not good enough to identify the driver. Ultimately, Frank's car was found in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, about 25 miles from his home, near Maria's apartment. Sometime later, Frank's dog, which had been acquired to replace a pet that perished in a fire, was also found. It is believed that the dog ran away, frightened by the gunshots, but its presence far from Frank's home raised suspicions. The disappearance of the animal was reported by the Spencer family, which by that time had gained a notorious reputation due to a high-profile court case and the harassments that became well known throughout the town, except to the police. Investigators theorized that Maria intended to take the dog for her children, but the animal escaped when Roca was transporting it in the stolen car. During Roca's interrogation, they attempted to determine the origin of his shoe prints in Frank's house, but the man preferred to concoct an unbelievable story about his supposed visit to Frank the day before the tragedy. Roca claimed that, despite the strained relationship between his daughter and Frank, he got along with Frank and had come to help him with cleaning, during which he accidentally left a mark on one of the already present bloodstains on the floor. However, Roca could not explain the presence of blood in the house, and his statements about friendship with Frank found no confirmation. None of the witnesses could attest to their good relationship, and the claims of friendship seemed unlikely. Additionally, Roca claimed he did not steal Frank's car, stating that Frank himself had offered him to use the car as he was supposedly planning to sell it. This twist in Roca's story seemed even more far-fetched, given the circumstances of their relationship and subsequent events. Roca claimed he took Frank's car a day before his death, supposedly coming to assist his former son-in-law. With this strange explanation, he tried to justify the potential discovery of his fingerprints or DNA on items in the deceased's home, essentially admitting his presence at the crime scene but trying to alter the chronology of events. The police still lacked more concrete evidence for charges, such as the murder weapon. However, Roca, being an experienced criminal, likely knew how to dispose of a firearm. A search of his home revealed neither the shotgun nor the pistol, and due to his probation terms, Roca had no right to own weapons, and Maria also did not have any registered weapons. But Roca's connections in the criminal world could have allowed him to easily acquire a weapon for killing Frank. Maria categorically denied her guilt, claiming the gloves ended up in Frank's house by accident and rejecting any involvement in the crime. Despite the absurdity of the provided explanations, the suspects were temporarily released, although the investigation continued to gather evidence against them. Maria continued to lead a normal life, attending, for example, her son's football match. During one such visit, a friend of Frank's tried to inquire about her possible involvement in the incident. Maria quickly realized his intention and gave evasive answers. Nonetheless, from her words, it could be inferred that she was present at the crime scene and witnessed Frank's death but was not his murderer. The state attorney general's office was drawn to the local authorities' indifference to Frank's accusations against his ex-wife. All his complaints were ignored, even though state law considers even indirect death threats as a serious crime and acts of arson as attempts at murder. Despite clear evidence, investigators took no steps to begin a full investigation into any of Frank's complaints, leaving the reasons for such inaction unclear to the prosecution. As a result of numerous accusations against the police regarding their inability and indifference to conduct investigations, an internal investigation was initiated. There were many complaints about detectives ignoring statements and justifying their stance with the lack of concrete evidence of threats. According to their claims, Frank supposedly did not provide any threats in the form of voice messages or textual evidence of stalking. Attempts to prove the investigators' negligent attitude toward the case were unsuccessful, as nothing was properly documented, and the only witness who could confirm or refute these claims was already dead. Public and Frank's family's dissatisfaction grew, yet numerous complaints remained unanswered, and the investigation once again reached a dead end. This time, the halt was due to the detectives' desire to charge the criminals not only with stalking and murder, but also with other legal violations committed before Frank's death. In 2013, a comprehensive interrogation was scheduled, and both suspects, Maria and Roca, finally agreed to speak with the police. Nonetheless, they denied their guilt on all 12 counts of charges. This led to additional charges of giving false statements. The main charge concerned the premeditated murder of Frank. The prosecution argued that the criminals arrived at the scene together, preferring not to use transportation to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. After shooting the defenseless victim, they fled in his car. During the investigation, both were placed under house arrest, But by the end of 2014, Maria was taken into custody. Roca, in turn, managed to flee, flying to Colombia immediately after giving his statement. His escape to South America was interpreted by the prosecution as an attempt to evade justice and an indirect admission of guilt. For 11 months, Roca hid until he was arrested near the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. After a brief fight against extradition, he was extradited back to his home country. In the fall of 2015, Maria stood trial for the murder of her ex-husband, continuing to deny her guilt and shifting it to her father. Prosecution witnesses detailed the threats and arsons committed by Maria. The trial lasted 9 days, after which the jury found her guilty on all charges, including murder, arson, burglary, giving false statements, conspiracy, and threats. Maria was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years. As a result, Maria remained behind bars forever. In 2017, Roca, after attempting to hide abroad, also stood trial late but inevitably facing justice. Roca was clearly disappointed by his daughter's attempt to shift the blame onto him. He claimed he was only helping her, but was categorically against murder. According to his statements, it was Maria who wished death upon her ex-husband. However, his poorly supported arguments did not convince the prosecution, and his story seemed powerless against compelling evidence. In the fall of 2018, Roca Franklin was found guilty of crimes against Frank Spencer, including murder, burglary, and arson, like his daughter. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 45 years. Custody of Maria and Frank's children was given to Maria's sister, ensuring they were provided with protection and care after the tragedy that shattered their family. Perhaps the most terrifying crime is that which is based on utterly unwarranted cruelty, especially when it involves children. According to these criteria, the case presented can be called one of the most repugnant and horrifying episodes in the history of world crimes. Louisa Cookham was born and raised in the challenging conditions of Westanari, South Africa, where her life path was inextricably intertwined with the cruelty of those around her. In 1980, when Louisa was 10 years old, her father died, with whom she had a warm relationship despite his years of hard work. He always made time for his daughter. The sudden death of her father was a big blow to Louisa, after which her mother remarried. The new husband turned out to be a cruel man, subjecting the entire family to both moral and physical humiliation. The years of his tyranny left a deep mark on Louisa's soul, causing her to feel inadequate and desiring to make those around her feel worthless. Upon reaching adulthood, Louisa could not bear such treatment and sought by any means to leave her family. Eventually, she hastily married the first man she met, Freddie, who was 4 years her senior and, to her horror, turned out to be no better than her stepfather. Finding herself trapped in terror and constant fear because of her husband, Louisa, fortunately, found a reliable support in her mother, who helped her escape the burden of toxic relationships. After separating from Freddie, Louisa met mechanic Christo Vandermerf, whose peaceful and hardworking character, as well as his care, seemed to her ideal qualities for a life together. They began dating and soon got married, continuing to live in the same area of South Africa. Their first child was a boy named Johan, and 2 years later, on August 9, 2013, a daughter Poppy was born, a girl of extraordinary beauty with blonde hair and clear blue eyes, whom everyone who saw her called a little doll and could not admire her enough. Unfortunately, Louisa's new union also ended in failure. After the children were born, her husband began to show aggression, which eventually led to physical violence. Realizing that the situation would not change for the better, Louisa decided it was time to draw a line and filed for divorce in 2014, just a year after their daughter's birth. According to Louisa's statements, Christo unleashed a torrent of insults and physical violence on her, similar to her previous partner, and just before the divorce, his actions escalated to threats of murder. His behavior became so extreme that Louisa, raising 2 children, was forced to obtain a court order restraining him from approaching her. After the official separation, Christo was limited to meeting with the children 3 times a month, provided a social services worker was present, and was also allowed weekly phone communication with the children, most of which was recorded. Despite adhering to all conditions and creating an appearance of decency, Louisa continued to insist on his true monstrous nature. In search of a peaceful life for herself and her children, the young mother decided to move, eventually ending up in the remote settlement of Oronea, located 500 kilometers away, where just over 1,000 people lived. This small town, populated exclusively by whites, was renowned for its safety and became a home for descendants of Dutch, Germans, and French, where Louisa hoped to find solitude and peace for her family. The small family was warmly received by the community of Oronea. Local residents and representatives of the Dutch Reformed Church offered support in adapting, helped settle in, find housing, and a job at a supermarket. They also assisted in finalizing the divorce process, in which Louisa was involved. She aimed to take Marissa, her ex-husband's daughter, from a previous union, who wished to live with her. In return, Marissa was willing to take on a significant part of the household duties and care for the younger children. With the support of the community, the young mother was able to take the teenager, who at 14 became a reliable helper, caring for the children and performing household tasks, including cooking and cleaning. Marissa became such an integral part of the family that the children sometimes referred to her as a mother. Her calmness and balance made Marissa more effective in raising the children compared to Louisa. All this happened against the backdrop of Louisa's intense work, which required her to invest maximum time and energy. In 2015, Cobus Camorra became a new resident of Oronea, where, thanks to community support, he managed to find a job at the local supermarket. It was there that he met a woman, a mother of 2 children who had been living in the settlement for a year. Similar to the story's main character, Cobus was followed by a complicated personal experience of several failed marriages and relationships, from each of which he had children. In fact, he had gone through divorce twice, each time committing to pay child support for his firstborn. But he hardly maintained any contact with the children and showed little interest in them. His relationships with his ex-spouses were extremely tense, and they in turn described him as merciless and cruel. Unfortunately, Louisa was not aware of the full extent of his past at the time of their acquaintance and was charmed by his friendly and kind demeanor, leading to a rapid development of their relationship. Shortly after the romance began, she accepted Cobus's proposal, and the couple decided to unite their destinies, organizing a wedding ceremony on November 14, 2015, and beginning their life together. Immediately after the marriage, Cobus made an unexpected decision to evict Marissa, sending her back to her father by bus, thereby depriving Johan and Poppy's children of a loving nanny and sister. This turn of events deeply traumatized the children, who had grown attached to Marissa as a stranger not interested in them appeared in their lives. As a result of such dramatic changes, the children became capricious and struggled with the separation from their sister. To great regret, Cobus quickly revealed himself to be not as they expected. Marissa's care provided the children with a sense of attention and time, becoming a close and dear person to them. Unlike her, Cobus showed irritability and reacted angrily to any of their tears. During this period, the children had to be sent to daycare, as the adults' occupations did not allow them to adequately care for the children at home. Educators noticed how Johan sought refuge in the bathroom upon the arrival of his mother and stepfather, indicating his reluctance to return home, a troubling sign for the staff. The daycare staff described Cobus as an extremely unpleasant and irritable person, showing coldness towards the children. A daycare worker's suspicions were raised several times. It seemed that when the parents brought him in, Johan was under the influence of some substances. His reactions appeared slowed, leading to speculation that he might have been given medication to sedate him, considering his high activity level, to make it easier to care for and supervise him. The parents apparently used sedatives on the child, but this assumption remained unconfirmed. When directly questioned by the teacher, they merely laughed. No further instances of such behavior were observed, however. Soon other troubling signs previously not taken seriously emerged. Educators noted that the boy was often dressed inappropriately for the season. Jackets and long-sleeve clothes in warm weather seemed out of place. It later turned out that this was done intentionally to hide bruises on his body. Attempts to undress Johan in daycare caused him to react aggressively and interfere with the educators, resulting in him staying in his outerwear all day. The boy's words did not leave the parents indifferent. They were clearly enraged by the thought that he might take off his warm clothes. The parents intimidated the boy to such an extent that the family's cruel treatment became clearly known to the daycare staff. After Louisa and Cobus began to inquire about the family's behavior, Johann was no longer brought to daycare. At the same time, Poppy continued to attend. Law enforcement decided not to involve the younger girl in daycare due to the inability to explain the situation at home. Despite communication difficulties, the child attempted to reveal the horrors of domestic violence. Poppy turned to the daycare workers with alarming stories and attempts to show the bruises on her body, but her speech was not understood. Over time, the daycare staff noticed bruises appearing in strange places on the child's body, emerging faster than they could heal. Louisa and Cobus were frequently questioned about the injuries. Nevertheless, the parents offered new explanations for the children's incidents each time. According to the mother and stepfather, Johann and Poppy were active. They ran and jumped a lot, which supposedly led to their bruises and scrapes during play or as a result of accidental falls. Since direct evidence of domestic violence could not be confirmed, the daycare workers had to take the presented stories at face value. Moreover, the mother often mentioned that the older brother was aggressive towards his younger sister. Louisa explained Johann's aggressive behavior as the reason for his absence from daycare, expressing concerns that he might harm other children and preferred not to bring him there until he became more manageable. This surprised the educators, as they never noticed any dangerous or aggressive behavior from the boy. On the contrary, he seemed withdrawn and avoided contact with others. Despite the convincing excuses from the parents, others suspected the presence of domestic violence in the family. A neighbor living next to the family noticed that the adults were rough with the children. He regularly heard the parents yell and insult the children for minor misdeeds. Although the neighbor did not witness physical violence, he was convinced of its presence, given the verbal punishments the children endured. One of the most troubling incidents the neighbor later recounted involved Poppy. According to his story, one day the stepfather suddenly started yelling loudly at the girl, apparently because she accidentally soiled the bed. Shortly after the harsh reprimands began, the girl screamed in such a way that it was clear this was not merely fear or upset. She was likely being hit. The next morning, the neighbor saw the girl with a cast on her leg. He particularly remembered the indifference of the parents when they returned with her from the hospital. Neither the mother nor the stepfather hurried to help her down from the backseat of the pickup, where she was transported in the cargo area as if she was an inanimate object. Moreover, the girl had to make her way out of the trunk herself, carrying a backpack that seemed considerably heavy. Instead of offering warm words of support, the stepfather merely hurried her along. The neighbor also noted that Poppy often woke up at night, breaking the silence with her cries. He speculated that the girl was having nightmares, but if the parents responded to her tears, it was only with shouts and reproaches, leading to her experiencing regular stress at night. After nighttime bouts of hysteria, the girl tried to cry as quietly as possible for about half an hour, trying not to be heard. But through the thin walls, the neighbor still caught her sobs. Eventually, she calmed down and fell asleep again by herself. After the incident with the broken leg, as soon as Poppy began to recover, another troubling incident of aggression occurred. The neighbor witnessed another argument in the house, which ended with a dull sound of impact, followed by the girl's loud crying, escalating into a tantrum. The next day, he noticed her walking by with a large bruise on her forehead, and it seemed her right arm was not functioning properly. Poppy kept it pressed to her torso. Unable to hold back, the man questioned the stepfather about the reasons for the girl's constant crying and her unhealing wounds. Cobus just smirked in response and became angry, providing no explanations and walking away. Instead, the girl's mother responded. Louisa claimed that the new injuries were the result of an accident from falling down the stairs while playing, adding that her daughter often found herself in such situations due to her carelessness. However, the neighbor did not believe her words. One incident that particularly outraged him occurred during the winter. In the cold weather, while Cobus was watering the garden, the children sat on the porch. Suddenly, the man began yelling at them, accusing them of some misdeeds. The neighbor found this unwarranted, as the brother and sister were simply sitting peacefully, doing nothing wrong. It seemed to him a strained pretext for an outburst of anger. Following this, Kobus stripped the children naked and doused them with cold water, forcing them to repeat an apology, which the neighbor could not make out. Being outside in the freezing cold until they were completely dry, the children experienced severe cold, sobbing and shivering from the chill, which could have led to serious illness. Faced with such actions, the neighbor could not remain indifferent and sought help from Child Protective Services. They were supposed to send a request for an investigation and compile a report for the local police station, then file a complaint with law enforcement. However, to his astonishment, no action followed from Child Protective Services. They seemed to ignore the information and appeals received. The neighbor had to repeatedly return to the workers of this service before they took the evidence of cruel treatment by the stepfather seriously. Additionally, because the town was so small, lacking a full-fledged police station, court, and other key institutions, the nearest police station was 40 kilometers away, and the neighbor had no means to get there himself. But he did not despair and continued to reach out to various local organizations, striving to ensure the children's safety. Fortunately, his efforts were successful. The guardianship and custodianship service workers finally paid attention to the situation, giving hope for an end to this horror for the children. In August 2016, a meeting was held with Louisa and Kobus, where the mother and stepfather were required to attend weekly pediatrician visits with the children. Additionally, they were prescribed a course of psychological counseling to address family issues. At first, it seemed that the spouses took these measures seriously. They visited the psychologist several times and went for medical examinations with the children twice in the first month. It appeared that the family was starting to improve. However, during this period, the neighbor continued to report the most severe cases of violence in the family. Returning to social services, he was told in response that the situation with the family was under control, but no improvements were happening. Despite his efforts, the neighbor found himself powerless to do more. His fears were confirmed when at the next examination, bruises were found on 3-year-old Poppy. Doctors tried to determine their origin, but due to the girl's age, her explanations were vague, though it was clear she was in pain. By procedure, the doctor was supposed to document any signs of injury, but in this case, the medic did not do so, later explaining that he could not get a clear explanation of the incident from the child and assumed the bruises were the result of domestic life, writing them off as accidental during play, a version supported by the mother. As a result of the lack of any action, one September morning in 2016, the neighbor discovered that Poppy's family had disappeared, having left overnight, likely to avoid attention. This secretive departure raised suspicions, while Kobus continued to attend his job, and the daycare staff where Poppy went were not informed about the move. The couple seemed to be seeking to evade responsibilities and avoid medical exams where they were nearly exposed. Choosing the path of disappearance, they moved to a new residence, heading to a farm owned by Louisa's mother, Galis, located several hours' drive from the town where the family had lived previously. This became a rare instance when Louisa and her mother gathered together with the children on the same property. Typically, Louisa tried to avoid letting the children have contact with their grandmother. Louisa's mother, despite her extensive experience living with an abuser, was shocked by the condition of her grandchildren. She immediately noticed numerous bruises covering the children's bodies, which was a shocking discovery for her. When the grandmother attempted to find out the origin of the numerous bruises from the boy, he pointed to Kobus as the cause of his injuries. Louisa, in turn, denied any accusations of domestic violence, calling Johan a liar. After visiting her daughter's home, the woman became deeply concerned about the situation within the family, but initially decided to seek advice from a pastor out of fear of causing harm. To her great disappointment, instead of the expected support, the spiritual mentor expressed displeasure, suggesting that the grandmother should not interfere in her daughter's private affairs since she was married and should solve her problems independently. After this conversation, Louisa's mother ceased seeking help and made no attempts to rescue the grandchildren. On October 25, 2016, a month after the family had been avoiding medical examinations, Louisa, in a panic, brought her daughter to the local hospital, claiming that the child suddenly fell ill and needed urgent help. Despite the medical team's resuscitation efforts, including artificial respiration, it was evident that the girl had been dead for some time, and no attempts could revive her. The doctors found Louisa's behavior suspicious. She seemed indifferent to the tragedy while expressing concerns about potential legal issues. The numerous injuries on the child's body, forming a single mass of bruises, drew particular attention. When asked about the origin of the bruises, Louisa answered that on the way to the hospital, due to road bumps, the child had severely bruised herself in the car's trunk, leading to the formation of the bruises. Louisa's deceit was almost immediately exposed. On Poppy's body, bruises at different stages of healing were discovered, indicating systematic violence. Fresh hematomas formed before previous ones had healed, and could not possibly be the result of accidental bruises from road bumps. The medic also noticed the family's second child, who had arrived with them. 5-year-old Johan looked very frightened, hiding in a corner and avoiding contact with the parents and other adults. The boy nervously muttered to himself and, when asked about his sister, said that Poppy no longer wanted to eat. His body also bore injury marks. All of this appeared highly suspicious and seemingly related to the tragedy that had befallen the 3-year-old girl. Therefore, the doctor decided to call the police. Louisa and Cobus tried to convince him not to do so, but the doctor ignored their pleas. When the first police officer arrived at the medical center, the doctor showed him a photograph of Poppy's body. The officer, being a father to a 1-year-old child himself, was so appalled by the extent of the girl's injuries that he was moved to tears. In his many years of service in law enforcement, the officer had never seen a body so mutilated, even among adults, let alone a toddler barely able to stand firmly on her feet. The stepfather was immediately taken to the police station, but Louisa was not detained, being considered a victim of domestic violence, just like the children. The true story of the 3-year-old child's death may never be fully revealed. It was partially reconstructed through witness testimonies, including the neighbor and the grandmother's accounts, the killer's words, and physical evidence. However, nearly all documents contained disputable points and contradictions. While Cobus was being taken and interrogated at the station, the officers decided to speak with Louisa. The woman recounted that shortly before the child's death, the child had hit her head on a cabinet. This happened on the eve of October 24th. After that, when the girl woke up the next day, her behavior seemed odd. She was almost lethargic, inactive, hardly spoke, and moved little. After the lunch break ended, Cobus returned from work, maintaining his usual depressive mood. This time, Louisa politely asked him to show restraint and not to be rough with the children, who were feeling unwell. However, this did not stop him. As a greeting, he kicked one of them in the stomach, as the mother of the deceased child recounted, claiming that such actions were routine for him. She did not wait for this violence to end and went shopping, talking about the incident with remarkable calmness. Upon Louisa's return, Cobus informed her of the girl's poor condition, saying that she had lost consciousness. The mother found her daughter in an empty bathtub and immediately noticed that the child's body was unusually cold and her lips were turning blue. They tried to revive the girl with artificial respiration, but unsuccessfully. Then they decided to take her to the hospital, placing her in the cargo bed of the pickup. This moment was one of the strangest in the story. Instead of carrying the 3-year-old girl in their arms, they placed her in the trunk like an inanimate object, where she helplessly bounced with every bump in the road. Such a mode of transportation unexpectedly explained the multitude of bruises on the deceased's body, making this detail a sad justification for the circumstances of their appearance. When the grandmother realized the tragedy that had befallen her granddaughter, she was deeply shocked, unable to believe that her own daughter could be involved. For her, as for many, the thought that such severe injuries could be the result of an accidental fall was unacceptable. Experts and medical professionals confirmed that the girl was systematically subjected to violence, possibly even thrown against walls and furniture. The autopsy report indicated significant blood accumulation in the lower left side of the skull, evidencing a serious injury capable of leading to a fatal outcome. Injuries and abrasions were found all over the body, predominantly on the face, chest, and thighs, creating the impression that they were caused by kicks, corroborated by the mother of the deceased's words. Other numerous injuries also indicated that the girl had been the object of deliberate and cruel violence, suffering from prolonged beatings. When this became known to the public, Cobus, being behind bars, faced aggression from other inmates who repeatedly attacked him and threatened to kill him. Meanwhile, Louisa, for unknown reasons, avoided law enforcement attention, despite her role in the incident. However, over time, information about her possible guilt in her daughter's fate spread among the town's residents, sparking a wave of outrage and a desire for retribution. The day before the farewell ceremony, on November 4th, 2016, Louisa encountered a visit from two women dressed in police uniforms. They convinced her to follow them to the station to give a statement. However, instead they took her outside the city, where they subjected her to a brutal beating. It turned out that these women were not affiliated with the police, but were ordinary citizens of the town who had decided to take justice into their own hands. As a result, Louisa arrived at her daughter Poppy's funeral, physically battered but alive, unlike her child. Poppy's biological father, Christa Vander Murph, was seen in tears during the farewell ceremony. He sat in the front row among friends and relatives, blaming his ex-wife, whom he considered an irresponsible mother. Louisa's face, showing signs of recent violence during the event, expressed not a hint of regret, displaying her indifference to her daughter's death. Louisa was taken into custody on December 15, 2016, facing charges similar to those against her husband. Despite the trial's active start, the process was postponed for a year and only began in October 2017. The main reason for the delay was the difficulty in finding a lawyer willing to defend the accused, as most attorneys were repulsed by the defendants and refused to take their case. Additionally, Cobus faced aggression from other inmates, leading him to attempt suicide twice, after which he spent a long time recovering in a medical facility. These circumstances contributed to the hearing's postponement, beneficially playing into the hands of the prosecution, providing additional time to gather testimony from Johan, the deceased brother. The boy confirmed that his stepfather regularly subjected him and his sister to physical violence, while his mother remained inactive, even covering for her husband and failing to help the children. According to Johan, the beatings were so severe that sometimes the loudness of the impacts exceeded their own cries of pain. His testimony became key in the case against his mother. Louisa attempted to defend herself, claiming she did everything possible to save her daughter, including dousing her with water and performing artificial respiration. However, Johan revealed that in reality, the girl was wet because after the beating, the stepfather dunked her head in the toilet, trying to revive her through flushing water, while their mother merely watched, making no attempt to stop Cobus. Ultimately, the court found both parents guilty of the girl's death and sentenced them to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In addition to the main sentence, each parent was sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison for endangering the life of the older child who narrowly escaped death, facing merciless treatment daily. The judge, in pronouncing the verdict, did not hide his outrage. Not only the brutality of the accused, but also their complete indifference to the consequences of their actions infuriated him. Among those present at the trial, there was a unanimous opinion that the defendants were indifferent to the girl's death, only concerned about their own punishment prospects. The case revealed a serious problem. Repeated pleas from neighbors to social services to check the family's conditions due to the brutal treatment of the children were ignored. None of these pleas led to the children's rescue. Later, social protection workers, who should have notified law enforcement, justified their inaction with logistical and bureaucratic difficulties, allegedly preventing them from responding promptly to the family situation. They faced no consequences for their lack of promptness.
In the serene and idyllic town of Pina Hill, the brutal slaying of Jennifer Johnson sent a wave of shock and disbelief through the community. The seemingly harmonious and tight-knit suburban haven was rocked by a crime fueled by passion and deceit, revealing the hidden darkness beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. This is the story of two couples, Daniel and Linda Garner, and Mark and Jennifer Johnson, whose lives became intertwined in a web of obsession, deception, and ultimately murder. Daniel Garner, a well-respected architect admired for his charming personality and successful career, was married to Linda, a devoted schoolteacher. Mark Johnson, a prosperous financial advisor, was married to Jennifer, a woman known for her captivating beauty and charisma. The two couples were more than just neighbors. They were the closest of friends, sharing weekend getaways, barbecues, and a consensual wife-swapping arrangement. What began as an exciting and novel addition to their lives soon turned sinister, as Daniel's fascination with Jennifer grew into an all-consuming obsession. Linda, aware of her husband's growing fixation on Jennifer, tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a passing phase. Jennifer, however, sensed the intensity of Daniel's feelings and decided to end the arrangement, unaware of the deadly consequences that would follow. The Garners had been married for a decade, and their union appeared to be one of happiness and stability. Daniel's innovative designs and charismatic nature made him a successful architect, while Linda, a beloved third-grade teacher, was admired by her colleagues and students alike. The Johnsons moved to Pine Hill 5 years prior and quickly befriended the Garners. Mark, an outgoing financial advisor, and Jennifer, a woman of striking beauty, brought a new energy to the neighborhood, and their friendship with the Garners blossomed. The idea of wife-swapping was first introduced during a dinner party at the Garners' residence. Fueled by wine and a sense of adventure, the conversation turned to open relationships. Surprisingly, the concept was met with intrigue rather than disapproval. Over the following weeks, the idea was discussed more seriously, with all parties agreeing to boundaries and rules to protect their primary relationships. The first encounter, though awkward, was exciting, and the couples found themselves eager for more. What started as an occasional experiment soon became a regular part of their lives, adding excitement to both marriages. Initially, the arrangement seemed to work well, with both couples appearing happier and more connected. They continued to socialize, hosting joint parties and going on vacations together, all while carefully guarding their secret. However, as the months passed, subtle changes began to emerge, particularly in Daniel's behavior. Daniel's growing interest in Jennifer became evident, as he found reasons to spend time alone with her. Linda noticed his preoccupation, but chose to ignore it, hoping it was just a phase. Mark, however, remained oblivious to the growing tension. Unbeknownst to the others, Daniel's fascination with Jennifer was evolving into something deeper and more troubling. His constant thoughts about her and their encounters consumed him, and what had started as a harmless adventure was slowly turning into an obsession with devastating consequences. Daniel's infatuation with Jennifer grew into an all-consuming obsession, dominating his thoughts during work meetings and family dinners. His architectural projects, once his passion, now seemed secondary to his desire for Jennifer. He started finding ways to be near her, volunteering to help with tasks Mark usually handled, or inviting the Johnsons over more frequently. Linda began to notice the change in her husband, attributing it to the excitement of their new lifestyle at first. However, it soon became clear that Daniel's interest in Jennifer went beyond their agreement. One evening, while cleaning up after a dinner party, Linda confronted Daniel about his growing obsession with Jennifer. His reaction was defensive, dismissing her concerns as jealousy. Linda, not wanting to disrupt their delicate balance, let it go but kept a closer eye on him. Her suspicions grew when she found him staring at Jennifer during gatherings, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. Jennifer, too, began to sense Daniel's growing obsession, initially flattered by his attention, but soon finding it uncomfortable. The turning point came during a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin, where Daniel's fixation on Jennifer became increasingly apparent. He monopolized her time, insisting on taking her out on the lake alone, leaving Mark and Linda behind. The tension was palpable, and Jennifer's attempts to distance herself were met with subtle resistance from Daniel. One night, while sitting by the fire, Daniel made a comment that crossed the line, suggesting they leave everything behind and start fresh together. Jennifer, shocked and unsettled, excused herself and went to bed early. Linda, who had overheard the conversation, confronted Daniel again, this time less dismissive but still refusing to acknowledge the depth of his feelings. Linda's frustration grew as she realized the extent of Daniel's obsession, fearing it could destroy their marriage and their friendship with the Johnsons. Despite her efforts to intervene, Daniel's behavior only became more erratic, following Jennifer outside of their arranged meetings and showing up at her workplace under the guise of casual visits. Jennifer's unease turned to fear, and she confided in a close friend who advised her to distance herself from Daniel as much as possible. Determined to take control, Jennifer decided to end the arrangement altogether, hoping that by doing so, Daniel would return to his senses and they could all move on from this chapter without causing further harm. One evening, while Mark was away on a business trip, Daniel showed up at the Johnsons' house unannounced. Jennifer, taken aback, let him in, hoping to avoid a scene. They sat in the living room, the air thick with tension, as Daniel confessed his feelings for her, speaking of a future where they could be together openly. Jennifer, horrified, tried to reason with him, explaining that their arrangement was never meant to be more than a temporary excitement. As Daniel's declarations became more intense, Jennifer's fear turned to anger, and she realized she needed to put an end to this before it destroyed her marriage and her friendship with Linda. Jennifer told Daniel firmly that their arrangement was over, and that he needed to respect her boundaries and her marriage. Daniel, visibly shaken, tried to persuade her to reconsider, but Jennifer stood her ground. Over the next few days, Jennifer avoided Daniel, hoping he would come to his senses. She confided in Linda, who listened with a heavy heart, feeling a twisted loyalty to Daniel despite wanting to support Jennifer. Linda promised Jennifer she would talk to him, hoping to defuse the situation. However, Daniel's obsession only deepened, and he started showing up at Jennifer's work, waiting for her after hours and leaving her messages expressing his undying love. Jennifer, feeling increasingly unsafe, decided to confront him one last time, hoping to make him understand the gravity of his actions. They met at a secluded park, away from prying eyes, where Jennifer reiterated that their arrangement was over and that his behavior was unacceptable. She pleaded with him to let go and move on, but Daniel, unable to accept her rejection, grew desperate. Unbeknownst to them, Linda had followed Daniel to the park, watching from a distance as the confrontation unfolded. She could see the anguish on Daniel's face and the determination on Jennifer's, knowing that this confrontation was inevitable, but also fearing what might happen next. As the argument escalated, Daniel's desperation turned to anger, and Jennifer's refusal to entertain his fantasies felt like a personal betrayal. He lashed out verbally, calling her names and accusing her of ruining his life. Jennifer, maintaining her composure, insisted that they part ways and return to their respective marriages. Linda, watching from the shadows, felt a surge of panic. She knew she had to intervene before things got out of hand. She stepped out of her hiding place and approached the two, her voice shaking as she called out to Daniel. The sight of Linda seemed to snap Daniel out of his rage, and he turned to her, his expression a mix of confusion and relief. Jennifer, taking advantage of the distraction, walked away, determined to put as much distance between herself and Daniel as possible. Linda, now alone with her husband, tried to calm him down, reassuring him that they would find a way to move past this. Inside, however, she knew that their lives had been irreversibly changed. The affair had reached its breaking point, and Jennifer's decision to end the arrangement had set off a chain of events that could not be undone. The confrontation at the park left Daniel in a state of turmoil. Jennifer's firm rejection and Linda's unexpected appearance had shaken him to his core. He returned home that night, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and despair. Linda, sensing the storm brewing within him, tried to soothe his troubled thoughts, but Daniel remained inconsolable. Over the next few days, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic, vacillating between bouts of intense anger and deep despondency. He stopped going to work, spending his days obsessing over Jennifer's rejection and the perceived injustices he had suffered. Linda, unable to reach him, felt her own frustration and fear growing. She knew something had to give, but she wasn't prepared for the drastic turn of events that would soon unfold. Jennifer, on the other hand, was determined to move forward. She avoided all contact with Daniel, focusing on her work and her relationship with Mark. She hadn't told her husband the full extent of Daniel's obsession, fearing his reaction and the potential fallout. She hoped that by cutting ties, Daniel would eventually come to terms with the end of their arrangement and leave her alone. One evening, Jennifer returned home from work to find Daniel waiting for her outside her house. Her heart sank at the sight of him, and she steeled herself for another confrontation. She approached him cautiously, her voice steady but firm as she told him to leave. Daniel, his eyes wild with desperation, begged her for one last chance to explain himself. Jennifer, sensing the futility of the conversation, tried to walk past him, but Daniel grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. Jennifer struggled to break free, her voice rising as she demanded he let go. The commotion attracted the attention of a neighbor who stepped outside to see what was happening. Seeing the neighbor, Daniel released Jennifer and fled. Jennifer, shaken and frightened, thanked the neighbor and hurried inside. She called Linda, hoping to find some way to resolve the situation without involving the police. Linda, hearing the fear in Jennifer's voice, agreed to meet with her the next day to discuss how to handle Daniel's increasingly unstable behavior. The next day, Linda met Jennifer at a local cafe. Jennifer, looking exhausted and tense, explained the encounter with Daniel and her growing fear for her safety. Linda listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan. She promised Jennifer that she would talk to Daniel and make him understand that their relationship was over. After the meeting, Linda returned home to find Daniel in a state of agitation. She confronted him about the incident with Jennifer, her voice a mix of anger and concern. Daniel, feeling cornered, lashed out at her, accusing her of taking Jennifer's side and betraying him. The argument escalated, and Linda, fearing for her own safety, retreated to their bedroom. That night, Daniel's thoughts turned darker. He couldn't accept that Jennifer had rejected him and that his own wife was against him. In his twisted mind, he believed that the only way to resolve the situation was to eliminate the source of his pain. He decided that if he couldn't have Jennifer, no one could. On a cold, clear night, Daniel made his way to the Johnsons' house. He knew Mark was out of town, leaving Jennifer alone. He broke in through a side window and made his way to the bedroom where Jennifer lay sleeping. The sight of her peaceful and unaware fueled his rage and desperation. He grabbed a kitchen knife and approached her, his mind filled with a chaotic mix of love and hatred. Jennifer awoke to the sight of Daniel standing over her, the knife gleaming in the dim light. She tried to scream, but Daniel covered her mouth, his grip strong and unyielding. In a fit of rage, he plunged the knife into her chest, silencing her cries as Jennifer's life slipped away. In the aftermath of the murder, Daniel fled the scene, his hands stained with Jennifer's blood. He returned home, where Linda found him trembling and incoherent. She realized immediately what he had done, and in a moment of twisted loyalty, she decided to help him cover up the crime. The life they had built, the secrets they had kept, were all at stake. Linda knew that if they were to survive, they needed to act quickly and decisively. Driven by a twisted sense of loyalty and self-preservation, Linda quickly took control of the situation. She led Daniel to the bathroom, instructing him to remove his clothes and wash off the blood. Her mind raced with the urgency of their predicament, knowing they had to act fast to cover up the crime and protect their secret life. Once Daniel was cleaned up, she sat him down and forced him to recount every detail of what had happened. Despite his emotional state, Daniel managed to provide a coherent account, his voice shaking with the weight of his actions. Linda devised a plan. They needed to create an alibi and dispose of any evidence linking them to the crime. She called a trusted friend, claiming that Daniel had been with her all evening, ensuring their alibi was backed up. Then she drove to a secluded area outside of town, where she burned Daniel's blood-stained clothes and the murder weapon, praying that the fire would consume any remaining evidence. The police questioned everyone in the neighborhood, including the Garners. Linda's carefully crafted alibi held up under scrutiny, and Daniel, though visibly distressed, managed to avoid raising suspicion. The investigation seemed to stall, with no concrete leads pointing to the Garners. Despite their initial success in evading the authorities, the psychological toll of the murder weighed heavily on both Daniel and Linda. Daniel became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the police were closing in on him. He withdrew from friends and colleagues, isolating himself in a web of fear and regret. Linda, while outwardly composed, felt the strain of their secret pressing down on her. She became hypervigilant, scrutinizing every interaction and behavior for signs of suspicion from those around them. The weeks following Jennifer's murder were a blur of tension and deception for the Garners. Linda took on the role of the stabilizer, managing Daniel's paranoia while ensuring their public facade remained intact. She monitored the news for any updates on the investigation, relieved that the police seemed to have no solid leads. However, Linda knew that maintaining their cover required more than just an alibi. They needed to create a narrative that would divert attention away from Daniel. She suggested to Daniel that he should appear more distraught over Jennifer's death, aligning himself with the community's grief and throwing off any suspicion. At social gatherings and community meetings, Daniel played the part of the grieving friend. He spoke of Jennifer with a mix of fondness and sorrow, his eyes often welling up with tears. Mark, devastated and desperate for answers, seemed to appreciate Daniel's empathy, never suspecting his friend's involvement in his wife's death. Daniel's mental state deteriorated further, his guilt manifesting in nightmares and hallucinations. He started drinking heavily, seeking solace in alcohol but finding only temporary escape. Linda, fearing he might confess in a drunken stupor, kept a close eye on him, often staying up late to ensure he didn't leave the house. One evening, as Daniel sat slumped over a glass of whiskey, he broke down. He confessed to Linda that he couldn't live with the guilt any longer and that he needed to come clean. Linda, panicked, tried to calm him down, suggesting they take a short trip out of town. They traveled to a secluded cabin in the mountains, hoping the change of scenery would help Daniel regain some semblance of peace. The isolation provided a temporary respite, allowing them to plan their next steps without the constant pressure of the investigation looming over them. During their time at the cabin, Linda reinforced the importance of their secrecy. She coached Daniel on how to handle police questioning and public interaction, drilling him until he could respond without hesitation. Linda's determination to protect their lifestyle and avoid imprisonment fueled her relentless drive to keep their story straight. Upon returning to Pine Hill, the Garners resumed their lives with a renewed sense of purpose. Daniel, though still haunted by his actions, managed to present a more stable front. Linda continued to manage their interactions with the community, ensuring they remained above suspicion. However, the cracks in their facade were beginning to show. Friends and neighbors noticed Daniel's increased drinking and erratic behavior, and whispers of his possible involvement in Jennifer's death began to circulate. Linda, ever vigilant, worked to quash the rumors, but she knew their time was running out. As the police investigation continued, new evidence came to light, pointing towards inconsistencies in Daniel's alibi. The Garners' carefully constructed world was on the brink of collapse, and the truth was closer to being revealed than ever before. Detective Mitchell interviewed the Garners separately, noting any discrepancies in their stories. Linda's carefully crafted alibi held up under scrutiny, and Daniel's emotional state seemed consistent with that of a grieving friend. However, Mitchell's instincts told her there was more to the story. As the weeks passed, new evidence emerged. Forensic analysis of Jennifer's phone records revealed a series of increasingly desperate text messages from Daniel, indicating his obsession with her. Mitchell brought Daniel in for further questioning, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his alibi and the nature of his relationship with Jennifer. Daniel, struggling to maintain his composure, stuck to the story Linda had coached him on, but his nervousness and evasive answers only heightened the detective's suspicions. The turning point came when a neighbor came forward with crucial information. They had seen Daniel's car parked near the Johnsons' house on the night of the murder, and remembered the strange behavior he had exhibited. This testimony, combined with the forensic evidence in Daniel's erratic behavior, was enough for the police to obtain a search warrant for the Garners' home. During the search, the police found remnants of the burned clothing and traces of blood that had seeped into the floorboards, despite Linda's thorough cleaning. This damning evidence, coupled with the witness testimony and phone records, painted a clear picture of Daniel's guilt. The net was closing in on the Garners, and Linda realized that their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. She knew that their only chance of escaping a lengthy prison sentence was to come up with a new plan, one that would shift the blame away from them and onto someone else. As the police closed in, Linda and Daniel faced the harsh reality of their situation. The lies and deceit that had once protected them were now threatening to unravel completely, and the truth was about to be revealed in a way they could never have anticipated. As the evidence against Daniel mounted, Detective Mitchell prepared to make her move. She brought Daniel in for another round of questioning, this time with a different approach. She laid out all the evidence they had gathered: the phone records, the witness testimonies, and the forensic findings. Daniel, cornered and overwhelmed, began to crack under the pressure. Mitchell pressed harder, suggesting that if Daniel came clean, he might receive a more lenient sentence. Daniel, unable to handle the weight of his guilt and the relentless questioning, finally broke down. He confessed to killing Jennifer, describing his obsession, the confrontation, and the moment he lost control. In his confession, Daniel also implicated Linda, revealing her role in covering up the crime. He described how she had helped him clean up, dispose of evidence, and craft an alibi. Mitchell, sensing the opportunity to get the full story, had Linda brought in for questioning as well. Confronted with Daniel's confession, Linda initially denied any involvement, but as Mitchell detailed the evidence in Daniel's account, Linda realized there was no way out. Her carefully constructed lies had finally unraveled. She admitted to helping Daniel, explaining that she had done it out of a misguided sense of loyalty and fear of losing everything they had built. The trial of Daniel and Linda Garner captivated Pine Hill and the surrounding region. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers eager to see the conclusion of the tragic tale. Daniel was charged with first-degree murder, and Linda was charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. Both pleaded guilty to their respective charges. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Linda, despite her role in the cover-up, received a lighter sentence due to her cooperation with the investigation and her previously clean record. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10. Mark Johnson, left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, found some solace in the justice served. But he continued to mourn the loss of his beloved wife, Jennifer, whose life was tragically cut short by a deadly infatuation that spun out of control.
On a fateful day, the 15th of October 2021, a distress call summoned the police to an apartment complex on Oak Street. The gruesome discovery that awaited them would linger in their memories for years to come. They found the lifeless body of Ethan Reed, a cherished local high school teacher aged 32, lying in a pool of his own blood. The main suspect was his girlfriend of 2 years, Olivia Rogan, a 29-year-old software engineer. As the investigation delved deeper, a chilling web of surveillance, manipulation, and escalating control was uncovered. This sinister network had ensnared Ethan in the months preceding his death. Hidden cameras, strategically placed throughout his apartment, revealed a silent tale of paranoia and obsession. The roots of Olivia Rogan's transformation into the central figure of a tragic true crime story stretch back to long before she crossed paths with Ethan Reed. Born in 1993 to Margaret and James Rogan, Olivia was raised in a middle-class suburb of Portland. Those close to the family observed Olivia's intense craving for attention and validation from an early age. Reflecting on her daughter's childhood in an interview following Olivia's arrest, Margaret Rogan shared her thoughts. Olivia was an exceptionally bright child, always leading her class, but she found it difficult to maintain lasting friendships, Margaret reminisced. Initially, I assumed it was merely shyness, but as she grew older, I observed how possessive she could be of her few friends. If they spent time with other children, Olivia would become sullen and withdrawn. This tendency persisted into Olivia's adolescent years. Her high school boyfriend, Alex Chen, later revealed to investigators Olivia's incessant need to know his whereabouts. She would call or text nonstop when we weren't together, he stated. If I didn't respond promptly, she'd appear wherever she believed I might be. I assumed it was because she cared deeply. Despite these interpersonal challenges, Olivia excelled academically. She graduated as valedictorian of her high school class and went on to study computer science at Stanford University. It was there that Olivia's controlling tendencies found a new outlet in the world of technology. Her college roommate, Sarah Jennings, remembered Olivia's fascination with coding and surveillance software. She was brilliant at it, Sarah said, but sometimes it felt like she was using her skills to keep tabs on everyone around her. She'd casually mention things about our classmates that she couldn't possibly have known without some kind of digital snooping. After graduating with honors, Olivia landed a prestigious job at a tech startup. Her colleagues described her as driven and meticulous, often working long hours to perfect her code. However, her personal life continued to be marked by tumultuous, short-lived relationships. Jason Tran, who dated Olivia for 6 months in 2019, described the relationship as intense and suffocating. She wanted to know everything about my day, my thoughts, my plans, he said. When I tried to set boundaries, she'd become angry or manipulative. It was exhausting. By the time Olivia moved back to Ashland in early 2020, accepting a remote position with her company, she had left a trail of broken relationships behind her. Yet those who knew her couldn't have predicted the dark turn her life would take when she met Ethan Reed. Ethan Reed's life stood in stark contrast to Olivia's tumultuous journey. Born in 1990 in Ashland, Ethan was the youngest of 3 children in a close-knit family. His older sister, Amanda Reed, described their childhood as idyllic. We grew up surrounded by nature, spending our summers hiking in the mountains and our winters skiing, Amanda said. Ethan was always the peacemaker, the one who could make anyone laugh. From an early age, Ethan showed a passion for learning and a natural ability to connect with others. His high school English teacher, Mrs. Elaine Hoffman, remembered him fondly. Ethan had a way of bringing out the best in his classmates. He was patient, kind, and had an infectious enthusiasm for literature. I always thought he'd make an excellent teacher someday. Mrs. Hoffman's prediction proved accurate. After graduating from university with a degree in English literature, Ethan returned to his hometown to teach at Ashland High School. Ethan's personal life was characterized by steady, long-term relationships. His college girlfriend, Laura Simmons, remained a close friend even after their amicable breakup. Ethan was always so balanced, she said. He valued his independence but was also incredibly loyal and supportive. We broke up because our career paths were taking us in different directions, but there was never any drama. The fateful meeting between Olivia Rogan and Ethan Reed occurred on a sunny Saturday afternoon in May 2020 at a local farmer's market. Olivia, still adjusting to life in Ashland, had ventured out to explore her new surroundings. Ethan, a regular at the market, was picking up fresh produce for the week. Their eyes met across a display of organic apples, and Ethan, ever the friendly local, struck up a conversation about the best varieties for baking. Olivia, charmed by his easygoing nature and warm smile, found herself lingering at the stall far longer than she'd intended. As they chatted, they discovered a shared love of classic literature and hiking. Ethan, impressed by Olivia's quick wit and intelligence, suggested they meet up for a hike the following weekend. Olivia, feeling an instant connection, eagerly agreed. Their first date was a hike up to Grizzly Peak, offering breathtaking views of the Rogue Valley. Ethan's friend Mark later recalled, Ethan came back from that hike on cloud 9. He couldn't stop talking about how smart and funny Olivia was, how they talked for hours without a lull in the conversation. Over the next few weeks, Olivia and Ethan's relationship blossomed rapidly. They spent long evenings discussing books, sharing meals, and exploring the natural beauty of Southern Oregon. To those around them, they seemed like a perfect match. However, even in these early honeymoon days of their relationship, there were subtle signs of Olivia's possessive nature. Ethan's sister, Amanda, noticed that Olivia seemed to monopolize his time. She'd call or text constantly when they weren't together, and she always seemed to have a reason why Ethan couldn't join family gatherings without her, Amanda said. Ethan, blinded by the excitement of new love, brushed off these early red flags. When his friend Mark expressed concern about the intensity of the relationship, Ethan laughed it off. "She's just excited about us," he said. "It'll calm down once we're more settled." Little did Ethan know that this was just the beginning of a pattern that would gradually tighten around him, slowly cutting him off from the life he had built and the people who cared about him most. By the fall of 2020, Olivia had all but moved into Ethan's apartment. Despite him never officially asking her to live with him, she began to exert influence over every aspect of his daily life, from what he ate to how he spent his free time. Ethan's colleague and friend, fellow English teacher Jessica Lawson, noticed changes in his behavior at work. He started turning down invitations to after-school happy hours, something he'd always enjoyed before, Jessica recalled. When I asked him about it, he said Olivia wasn't comfortable with him being out late. Olivia's control extended to Ethan's social media presence. Friends noticed that his usually active Facebook and Instagram accounts became sparse, with posts becoming infrequent and impersonal. When questioned, Ethan would brush it off, saying he was trying to be more private online. But it was Olivia's attempts to isolate Ethan from his family that raised the most alarm bells. Amanda Reed remembered a particularly disturbing incident during the 2020 holiday season. "We always have a big family Christmas at our parents' house," she said. "But that year, Ethan called at the last minute to say he and Olivia couldn't make it. When I pressed him, he said Olivia wasn't feeling well and he needed to stay with her. But I could hear her in the background sounding perfectly fine." Olivia employed a variety of emotional manipulation tactics to maintain her grip on Ethan. She would oscillate between lavishing him with affection and subjecting him to cold, silent treatments if he didn't comply with her wishes. Ethan's friend Mark recounted a camping trip they had planned for months. "The night before we were supposed to leave, Ethan called to cancel," Mark said. "He sounded so defeated. He said Olivia was upset he was going away without her, even though she'd been invited and had declined." As 2021 progressed, Olivia's behavior became more erratic. She began accusing Ethan of infidelity, despite having no evidence to support her claims. She would show up unannounced at the high school, ostensibly to bring Ethan lunch, but colleagues noted how she seemed to be scanning the room as if looking for signs of inappropriate behavior. Emma Chen, one of Ethan's students, later testified to a disturbing encounter. "Miss Rogan came into our classroom during lunch break. Mr. Reed wasn't there, but she stayed anyway, asking us questions about him. It felt really weird and invasive." Despite the mounting evidence of Olivia's controlling behavior, Ethan remained committed to the relationship. Those close to him noted his increasing stress and anxiety, but he would deflect their concerns, often making excuses for Olivia's actions. His sister, Amanda, confronted him directly in the summer of 2021. "I told him I was worried that this didn't seem like a healthy relationship," Amanda said. "But he just got defensive. He said I didn't understand Olivia, that she'd been hurt in the past and needed extra reassurance. He truly believed he could help her overcome her insecurities." As Olivia's paranoia and need for control reached new heights, she made a decision that would irreversibly alter the course of her relationship with Ethan and ultimately lead to its tragic conclusion. In late August 2021, while Ethan was away at a weekend teaching conference, Olivia took the drastic step of installing hidden cameras throughout his apartment. The idea had been brewing in Olivia's mind for weeks. Her background in software engineering made the technical aspects of the plan feasible, and her growing suspicions about Ethan's fidelity provided the justification she needed to overcome any moral qualms. Olivia meticulously planned the operation, purchasing small, high-definition cameras disguised as everyday objects, a smoke detector, a phone charger, even a potted plant. She also set up sophisticated software that would allow her to access the feeds remotely from her laptop or phone. On the Friday afternoon that Ethan left for his conference, Olivia sprang into action. She had a key to his apartment, ostensibly for emergencies, which gave her unfettered access. Over the next several hours, she carefully placed cameras in the living room, kitchen, bedroom, and even the bathroom, ensuring every corner of Ethan's private space was under surveillance. With the cameras in place and the software running smoothly, Olivia left the apartment, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and guilt. She told herself that this was a necessary step, that it would allay her fears and allow her to trust Ethan completely. The first few days of monitoring proved uneventful. Olivia watched as Ethan went about his daily routines, grading papers, preparing lessons, chatting on the phone with his sister. But rather than easing her suspicions, the lack of incriminating evidence only fueled Olivia's paranoia. She began to obsess over minor details. Why did Ethan smile at that text message? Who was he waiting to meet out the window? Olivia's colleague, David Cho, later recalled noticing changes in her behavior at work during this time. She seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone, David said. I caught a glimpse of her screen once. It looked like a video feed, but she quickly closed it when she saw me looking. As the days turned into weeks, Olivia's obsession with the camera feeds grew. She began neglecting her work, her sleep suffered, and her interactions with Ethan became increasingly strained as she struggled to keep her secret. One evening, while reaching for a book on his shelf, Ethan noticed that several volumes were slightly out of place. He distinctly remembered organizing them just days before. In the bathroom, his toiletries seemed rearranged, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly how. More unsettling were the times he felt as if he was being watched. He'd be grading papers in the living room and suddenly feel a prickle on the back of his neck, as if someone's eyes were on him. But when he looked up, he was alone. Ethan's friend and fellow teacher, Jessica Lawson, recalled a conversation they had during this period. He mentioned feeling on edge in his own home, Jessica said. He laughed it off, saying he was probably just stressed about work, but I could tell it was really bothering him. Olivia's behavior added to Ethan's growing discomfort. She began making comments about his daily activities that she shouldn't have known about. Once she mentioned in passing that she liked the new brand of coffee he'd bought, despite not having been to his apartment in days. Another time she asked about a phone call he'd had with his mother, though he was certain he hadn't mentioned it to her. When Ethan would express confusion about these slip-ups, Olivia would quickly change the subject or provide vague explanations. He must have mentioned the coffee in passing, she'd say, or perhaps his mother had told her about the call. As his unease grew, Ethan found himself second-guessing his own memories and perceptions. Am I just being paranoid? He wondered. Is the stress of work getting to me? Despite his attempts to rationalize the strange occurrences, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He began to pay closer attention to his surroundings, noting any changes or oddities in his apartment. He even considered confiding in his sister, Amanda, but hesitated, worried that his suspicions might sound absurd or that he might be overreacting. The moment of revelation came on an October evening in 2021. Ethan had been grading papers late into the night. The soft glow of his laptop illuminated the living room as he stretched and prepared to call it a night. His elbow knocked a small potted plant off the side table. The pot shattered on the hardwood floor, soil and ceramic shards scattering across the room. As Ethan knelt to clean up the mess, something caught his eye amidst the debris. A tiny lens no bigger than a pencil eraser glinted in the low light. His heart racing, Ethan carefully extracted the object from the soil. It was a miniature camera, expertly concealed within the plant's base. The discovery sent a chill down Ethan's spine. With trembling hands, he began a frantic search of his apartment. Over the next hour, he uncovered 5 more hidden cameras in the smoke detector, a picture frame, even the shower head. The realization that his most private moments had been under surveillance was overwhelming. Ethan's mind reeled as he pieced together the implications. The strange comments Olivia had made, her uncanny knowledge of his daily activities, the feeling of being watched, it all suddenly made horrifying sense. The woman he had loved and trusted had violated his privacy in the most intimate way possible. In a daze, Ethan called the one person he knew he could trust implicitly, his sister, Amanda. It was past midnight, but she answered on the second ring, immediately alert at the sound of distress in her brother's voice. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, concern evident in her tone. Through a voice choked with emotion, Ethan recounted his discovery. Amanda listened in shocked silence, her initial disbelief quickly turning to anger on her brother's behalf. As Ethan's story unfolded, Amanda's protective instincts kicked in. "You need to get out of there," she insisted. "Pack a bag and come to my place. We'll figure this out together." But Ethan was torn. Part of him wanted to confront Olivia immediately, to demand answers and explanations. Another part was simply numb with betrayal, struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with someone capable of such a gross invasion of privacy. In the end, it was Amanda's steady voice that guided his next actions. "Document everything," she advised. "Take pictures of the cameras, save any recordings you can find. We'll go to the police in the morning." As the first light of dawn broke over Ashland, Ethan sat on his couch, surrounded by the dismantled remains of Olivia's surveillance network. His phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Good morning, babe. Sleep well?" The irony of her feigned normalcy was not lost on Ethan. With a deep breath, he typed out a response that would set in motion the final tragic act of their relationship. "We need to talk. Come over as soon as you can." The tension in Ethan's apartment was palpable as Olivia arrived later that morning. She entered with her usual smile, leaning in for a kiss, but froze when she saw Ethan's grim expression and the array of dismantled cameras on the coffee table. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Olivia's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Ethan, I can explain," she began, her voice quavering. But Ethan, his voice low and controlled, cut her off. He spoke of trust betrayed, of the sanctity of privacy violated. With each word, Olivia seemed to shrink, her usual confidence evaporating in the face of her exposed deception. When Ethan finally fell silent, Olivia launched into a desperate justification of her actions. She spoke of her deep-seated insecurities, her fear of losing him, her conviction that if she could just prove to herself that he was faithful, she could finally relax into their relationship. Her words came out in a rush, pleading and explanatory, but Ethan remained unmoved. "I can't be with someone who would do this," he said firmly. "We're done, Olivia. I want you to leave." Olivia's demeanor changed in an instant. Her tears dried up, replaced by a cold, hard look. "You can't do this to me," she hissed. "We're perfect together. You're overreacting." As Ethan stood firm in his decision, Olivia's pleas turned to threats. She spoke of ruining his career, of telling his students and colleagues about embarrassing moments she'd captured on camera. When these threats failed to sway Ethan, she resorted to emotional manipulation, threatening self-harm if he left her. Throughout it all, Ethan remained resolute, even as his heart broke at the sight of Olivia's desperation. He knew with a clarity that surprised him that there was no coming back from this betrayal. Finally, seeing that her words were having no effect, Olivia stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her. Ethan sank onto the couch, emotionally exhausted. He thought the worst was over. He had no idea that Olivia's desperation was about to take a far more dangerous turn. The events of October 15th, 2021 would forever be etched in the memories of Ashland's residents. The day began like any other, with no indication of the tragedy that would unfold. Ethan, emotionally drained from the confrontation with Olivia, had called in sick to work. He spent the morning talking with his sister Amanda, making plans to file a police report about the hidden cameras. As evening approached, he decided to take a walk to clear his head, leaving his phone behind to avoid any desperate messages from Olivia. It was during this absence that Olivia made her final, fatal return to Ethan's apartment. Neighbors would later report seeing her enter the building, her face set in a mask of determination. She used her key to let herself in, her mind racing with a mix of anger, desperation, and a twisted sense of righteous indignation. When Ethan returned home around 7 p.m., he found Olivia waiting for him in the darkened living room. The sight of her there, uninvited and unexpected, sent a jolt of fear through him. "Olivia, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice shaky. Olivia's response was chilling in its calmness. "We're going to fix this, Ethan," she said. "You'll see that we belong together." What followed was a heated argument that quickly spiraled out of control. Olivia vacillated between pleading for another chance and lashing out with bitter accusations. Ethan, his patience exhausted, demanded that she leave immediately. It was then that Olivia's fragile control snapped. In a move that would shock even those who knew of her obsessive tendencies, she produced a kitchen knife she had taken from Ethan's own drawer. The next few moments were a blur of violence and terror. Ethan, caught off guard by the sudden escalation, tried to reason with Olivia even as he backed away from the blade. But Olivia, beyond the reach of reason, lunged forward. In the struggle that ensued, Ethan's training as a former high school wrestler came into play. He managed to grapple with Olivia, trying to disarm her without causing harm. But in her frenzied state, Olivia's strength seemed superhuman. Neighbors would later report hearing shouts and the sound of breaking glass. One, concerned by the commotion, called 911, but help would arrive too late. By the time police broke down the door of Ethan's apartment, the tragic scene had already played out to its grim conclusion. They found Ethan on the floor, with multiple stab wounds marking his body. The life was already fading from his eyes. Olivia sat beside him, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand, her gaze vacant as she stared at what she had done. As paramedics rushed in, futilely attempting to save Ethan's life, Olivia offered no resistance when the police took her into custody. Her only words, repeated over and over like a mantra, were, "He was supposed to love me forever." The investigation, led by Detective Sarah Nguyen of the Ashland Police Department, quickly uncovered the full extent of Olivia's surveillance operation, revealing months of invasive monitoring. This digital trail, along with physical evidence from the crime scene and witness statements, painted a damning picture of obsession and premeditated violence. Ethan's family and friends were devastated. His sister Amanda, in particular, struggled with guilt. "I knew something was wrong," she said in a tearful interview. "I should have pushed harder, done more to get him away from her." As the investigation progressed, more details of Olivia's troubled past came to light. Former colleagues and ex-boyfriends came forward with stories of her controlling behavior and emotional manipulation. Her parents, shell-shocked by their daughter's actions, could only offer tearful apologies to Ethan's family. The district attorney presented a methodical case, walking the jury through the progression of Olivia's obsessive behavior. Covert surveillance footage played a central role, starkly illustrating the invasion of Ethan's privacy. The defense didn't contest the basic facts of the case. Instead, they focused on Olivia's mental state, bringing in expert witnesses to testify about her history of attachment issues and borderline personality disorder. They argued that Olivia's actions were the result of a mental health crisis, not premeditated murder. Olivia herself took the stand, her testimony an unsettling mixture of remorse and rationalization. She spoke of her deep love for Ethan and her fear of abandonment, claiming that she never meant to hurt him. Her apparent lack of full comprehension of the gravity of her actions left many in the courtroom disturbed. After a 2-week trial and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a scathing indictment of Olivia's actions before sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Ashland slowly healed, the community was left to reflect on the nature of love, trust, and the human capacity for both compassion and cruelty. The case would be remembered not just for its shocking conclusion, but as a catalyst for change and a somber reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing toxic relationship dynamics before they escalate to tragedy. At the heart of this harrowing tale, 3 souls found themselves irrevocably entwined: the captivating entrepreneur, Oliver Holbrook, the dedicated educator, Taylor Tanner, and the enigmatic new arrival, Claire Reeves. Their paths converged in a whirlwind of longing, envy, and duplicity, ultimately resulting in a tragic demise for 2 and an irrevocable transformation for the surviving individual. Oliver Holbrook, a native of Millbrook, was the sole offspring of Robert and Elizabeth Holbrook. From his formative years, it was evident that Oliver was bound for greatness. His father, a distinguished local lawyer, imbued him with a robust work ethic and unyielding ambition. His mother, a former pageant winner turned socialite, imparted the nuances of charm and social finesse. Throughout his adolescence, Oliver shone in both scholastic and athletic pursuits. He held the position of captain for the high school football team, presided over the student council, and graduated as the class of valedictorian. Post-graduation, Oliver pursued business and economics at an Ivy League institution. Nevertheless, there existed a concealed aspect to Oliver Holbrook, one that remained largely unseen. Beneath his affable demeanor and disarming charm resided a shrewd intellect and an unquenchable thirst for dominance. He was a consummate manipulator, adept at discerning vulnerabilities and capitalizing on them for personal advantage in both professional and private contexts. Oliver perceived relationships as transactions, continually seeking personal benefits. Despite his accomplishments, Oliver remained perpetually discontented. He yearned for incessant affirmation and recognition, a requirement that surfaced in a series of amorous pursuits. He garnered a reputation as a charmer, leaving a succession of heartache in his trail. As he neared his mid-30s, Oliver started to sense the societal expectation to stabilize his life, at least superficially. He recognized that a spouse would bolster his persona as a reputable businessman and community leader. With this perspective, Oliver initiated relationships with both Taylor Tanner and Claire Reeves. In Taylor, he discerned the quintessential prospect for the position of Mrs. Holbrook, appealing, popular, and hailing from a respectable lineage. Conversely, Claire embodied adventure and fervor, a clandestine indulgence he had no plans to relinquish. Unbeknownst to Oliver, his meticulously orchestrated existence was on the brink of disintegration, triggered by the very women he presumed he could dominate. Taylor Tanner personified the quintessential neighbor's daughter. A lifelong resident of Millbrook, she occupied the middle child position in a family of 5. Her parents, Michael and Linda Tanner, were esteemed community members. Her father served as the town's cherished general practitioner, while her mother dedicated years of service to the local animal shelter. Taylor's upbringing was characterized by affection and constancy. The Tanner residence was perpetually abuzz with activity, resonating with mirth and the enticing scent of her mother's culinary creations. This nurturing milieu molded Taylor into a benevolent and understanding young woman, ever prepared to extend assistance or a sympathetic ear to those in distress. Upon completing her degree, Taylor secured a position teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary School. It was at a local charity event organized to raise funds for the school's new library that Taylor first met Oliver Holbrook. She was immediately drawn to his charisma and confident demeanor. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance that seemed plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. Oliver wooed Taylor with grand gestures, surprise weekend getaways, lavish gifts, and romantic dinners at upscale restaurants. For Taylor, who had always led a relatively simple life, the attention was intoxicating. She fell deeply in love, believing she had found her soulmate. Claire Reeves arrived in Millbrook like a gust of wind, stirring up the quiet town with her mysterious past and alluring presence. Unlike Taylor and Oliver, Claire was an outsider. Having grown up in a series of foster homes across the state of New York, her childhood was marked by instability and loneliness. These experiences shaped her into a complex and often unpredictable adult. Born to a teenage mother who struggled with addiction, Claire was placed in the foster care system at the age of 3. Over the next 15 years, she bounced from one home to another, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting connections. This transient lifestyle left Claire with a deep-seated fear of abandonment and a desperate need for love and acceptance. Despite the challenges of her upbringing, Claire was fiercely intelligent and ambitious. She excelled in school, using her studies as an escape from the chaos of her personal life. Her academic success eventually earned her a scholarship to a prestigious university in New York City, where she studied psychology. After graduation, Claire worked as a marketing executive in Manhattan for several years. She was successful in her career, but her personal life was a series of short-lived, tumultuous relationships. Each failed romance left her feeling more empty and desperate for connection. It was in the wake of a particularly painful breakup that Claire decided to leave the city behind and start fresh. She had inherited a modest sum of money from a former foster mother who had shown her particular kindness, and she used this windfall to buy a small cottage on the outskirts of Millbrook. Claire was drawn to the town's picturesque charm and the promise of a simpler life. Upon her arrival in Millbrook, Claire quickly caught the attention of the locals. Her striking looks and big city sophistication made her stand out in the small town. She found work as a consultant for local businesses, using her marketing expertise to help them expand their reach. It was at one of these consulting jobs that Claire first encountered Oliver Holbrook. The attraction between them was immediate and electric. In Oliver, Claire saw everything she had ever wanted: success, stability, and the promise of love. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope for a happy ending. As Claire and Oliver began their clandestine affair, she convinced herself that she had finally found her place in the world. She threw herself into the relationship with the desperation of someone who had never known true belonging. However, Claire's fragile sense of security would soon be shattered by the revelation of Oliver's engagement to Taylor. This betrayal would trigger all of Claire's deepest fears and insecurities, setting in motion a tragic chain of events that would leave an indelible mark on the town of Millbrook. A summer turned to fall in Millbrook, and the lives of Oliver, Taylor, and Claire became increasingly entangled in a complex web of desire, deceit, and jealousy. Oliver, ever the skilled manipulator, carefully navigated his relationships with both women, feeding each of them just enough attention and affection to keep them invested. With Taylor, Oliver played the role of the devoted fiancé. He attended local events by her side, charmed her family at Sunday dinners, and made grand plans for their future together. Taylor basked in the glow of their engagement, excitedly sharing details of their upcoming wedding with anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, Oliver's encounters with Claire took place in the shadows. They met in out-of-the-way restaurants in neighboring towns or at Claire's secluded cottage. During these stolen moments, Oliver showered Claire with the passion and intensity that he carefully held back from Taylor. He fed Claire's hopes with vague promises of a future together, always with the caveat that he needed time to handle things with Taylor. As the weeks passed, tension began to build between Taylor and Claire, even though Taylor remained unaware of the true nature of Claire's relationship with Oliver. The two women often found themselves at the same local events, with Claire's presence invariably drawing Oliver's attention away from his fiancée. Taylor, trusting and naive, initially tried to befriend Claire, sensing the newcomer's loneliness. She invited Claire to girls' nights out and community functions, unwittingly providing more opportunities for Oliver and Claire to cross paths. Claire, consumed by her feelings for Oliver and racked with guilt over betraying Taylor's friendly overtures, became increasingly volatile. Her behavior swung between overly solicitous towards Taylor and barely concealed hostility. These mood swings did not go unnoticed by the townspeople, who began to speculate about the source of Claire's apparent instability. Oliver observed the growing friction between the two women with a mixture of anxiety and satisfaction. While he worried about his carefully constructed double life unraveling, he also reveled in the knowledge that two beautiful women were competing for his affections. As autumn progressed and the date of Oliver and Taylor's wedding drew nearer, the situation became increasingly untenable. Claire's demands for Oliver to leave Taylor grew more frequent and desperate, while Taylor remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. Little did any of them know that their actions over the next few months would shatter the peaceful facade of Millbrook and change their lives forever. On a crisp October morning, the day of Oliver and Taylor's wedding arrived. The entire town of Millbrook seemed to be in attendance, filling the picturesque white church to capacity. Taylor, radiant in a classic white gown, walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her face beaming with joy and love. Oliver stood at the altar, outwardly the picture of a happy groom. But those who knew him well might have noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that belied his calm exterior. As he recited his vows, promising to love and cherish Taylor for all eternity, his thoughts couldn't help but stray to Claire. Unbeknownst to the happy couple and their guests, Claire was outside the church, hidden from view but close enough to hear the ceremony. Each word of love and devotion that echoed from within the building was like a dagger to her heart. As the church bells rang out, signaling the completion of the ceremony, Claire felt something inside her snap. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, with the entire town celebrating the union of two of its most beloved residents. Taylor danced and laughed, surrounded by friends and family, while Oliver played his role to perfection, ever the charming and attentive new husband. But as the night wore on and the champagne flowed freely, Oliver found his mask slipping more than once. Taylor caught him staring off into the distance, a troubled expression on his face. When she asked what was wrong, he brushed off her concerns with a quick smile and a kiss. As the newlyweds drove off to their honeymoon, tin cans rattling behind their car and well-wishes ringing in their ears, neither of them could have imagined the dark turn their lives were about to take. For in the shadows, Claire Reeves was already plotting her revenge. In the weeks following Oliver and Taylor's wedding, Claire Reeves spiraled into a pit of despair and obsession. The life she had imagined for herself, a future with Oliver, had been snatched away, leaving her feeling betrayed and discarded. Her fragile psyche, already damaged by years of abandonment and instability, began to fracture under the weight of her grief and anger. At first, Claire tried to move on. She threw herself into her work, taking on more consulting projects than ever before. She attempted to socialize, accepting invitations to local gatherings and community events. But everywhere she went, she was confronted with reminders of Oliver and Taylor's happiness. The newlyweds were the talk of the town, their smiling faces seeming to mock Claire at every turn. As her pain deepened, Claire's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started showing up late to meetings or missing them entirely. Her appearance, once impeccable, grew disheveled. Concerned neighbors reported seeing her wandering the streets late at night, muttering to herself. But it was Claire's growing obsession with Taylor that truly marked her descent into madness. She began stalking the young teacher, following her to and from work, watching her house from a distance. Claire convinced herself that if she could just understand Taylor, figure out what made her so special in Oliver's eyes, she could win him back. Claire's cottage became a shrine to her obsession. Walls were covered with photos of Taylor, cut from local newspapers and printouts from social media. She created elaborate timelines and diagrams, trying to piece together every detail of Taylor's life and her relationship with Oliver. As weeks turned into months, Claire's fantasies grew darker. She began to imagine scenarios where Taylor was out of the picture, leaving the path clear for her to reclaim Oliver's affections. At first, these were harmless daydreams, Taylor moving away or realizing she didn't love Oliver after all. But gradually, Claire's thoughts turned to murder. She spent hours researching different methods, weighing the pros and cons of each with a detached, almost clinical precision. She created multiple plans, each more elaborate than the last, always careful to cover her tracks and establish alibis. Throughout this time, Claire maintained sporadic contact with Oliver. Their encounters were brief and increasingly tense, with Claire alternating between desperate pleas for him to leave Taylor and bitter accusations of betrayal. Oliver, growing uncomfortable with Claire's intensity, began to distance himself, unaware of the dangerous turn her obsession had taken. As winter settled over Millbrook, Claire's plans began to crystallize. She had chosen her method, a staged hit-and-run accident that would leave no trace of her involvement. In her deluded mind, she had convinced herself that eliminating Taylor was not just for her own benefit, but for Oliver's as well. She truly believed that he was trapped in an unhappy marriage and that she would be liberating him. The night before she planned to carry out her deadly scheme, Claire stood in front of her mirror, barely recognizing the wild-eyed woman staring back at her. For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. But then she remembered the sound of wedding bells, the sight of Oliver kissing his bride, and her resolve hardened once more. On a foggy Wednesday morning in February, Taylor Tanner Holbrook left her house for her daily jog, just as she had done countless times before. The streets were quiet, most of Millbrook's residents still tucked away in their warm beds. Taylor, with her bright yellow running jacket and bouncing ponytail, was a spot of color in the gray landscape. Unbeknownst to Taylor, Claire Reeves was waiting. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation as she sat in a stolen car at the end of a secluded stretch of road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. As Taylor's form appeared through the mist, Claire took a deep breath and turned the key in the ignition. The next few moments passed in a blur of screeching tires, a muffled scream, and the sickening thud of impact. Claire, operating on autopilot, quickly drove away from the scene, leaving Taylor's crumpled body on the side of the road. It was a jogger who found Taylor an hour later. By then, it was too late. Despite the best efforts of paramedics, Taylor was pronounced dead at the scene. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire, leaving the town reeling in shock and grief. In the immediate aftermath, Claire's plans seemed to work perfectly. The police initially treated the incident as a tragic hit-and-run accident. Claire had meticulously planned her alibi, making sure she was seen at a 24-hour diner in a neighboring town both before and after the time of Taylor's death. Oliver, upon hearing the news of his wife's death, put on a convincing display of grief. He wept openly at the funeral, leaning on friends and family for support. To all outward appearances, he was a devastated widower struggling to come to terms with his loss. But as the initial shock wore off and the investigation deepened, cracks began to appear in the facade. Detective Lisa Monteague, assigned to the case, sensed that there was more to Taylor's death than a simple accident. As she dug deeper, she began to uncover the tangled web of relationships that had led to this tragic event. Meanwhile, Claire watched from the sidelines, a mix of guilt and triumph warring within her. She had achieved her goal. Taylor was gone. Now, surely Oliver would be hers. But as the days passed and Oliver remained distant, doubt began to creep into her mind. Had she made a terrible mistake? In the weeks following Taylor's death, Millbrook was shrouded in a pall of grief and suspicion. The once friendly neighbors now eyed each other warily, wondering if a killer walked among them. Detective Monteigue's investigation sent ripples through the community as she interviewed friends, family, and acquaintances of Taylor. Oliver Holbrook maintained his role as the grieving widower, making tearful appearances on local news channels and offering a substantial reward for information leading to the arrest of Taylor's killer. He threw himself into charity work in Taylor's name, establishing a foundation to support local education initiatives. Claire, meanwhile, struggled to maintain her composure. The guilt of her actions weighed heavily on her, manifesting in bouts of insomnia and panic attacks. She obsessively followed the news of the investigation, terrified that each day would bring a knock on her door from the police. As Detective Monteague delved deeper into Taylor's life, she began to uncover inconsistencies in Oliver's story. Several witnesses reported seeing him arguing with Taylor in the weeks leading up to her death. Financial records showed large, unexplained withdrawals from their joint account. The detective's attention also turned to Claire. Her erratic behavior in the months prior to Taylor's death had not gone unnoticed, and her sudden calming in the aftermath raised suspicions. When questioned, Claire's alibi seemed airtight, but Detective Monteague sensed she was hiding something. As winter gave way to spring, Claire's initial elation at having eliminated her rival began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Despite her expectations, Oliver had not rushed into her arms in the wake of Taylor's death. In fact, he had become increasingly distant, avoiding her calls and making excuses to cancel their planned meetings. Frustrated and confused, Claire decided to confront Oliver at his office after hours. As she approached the building, she noticed a light on in his window. Peering inside, she saw Oliver in an intimate embrace with a woman she did not recognize. The sight sent Claire reeling, her world crumbling around her. In that moment, the full weight of what she had done came crashing down on her. She had murdered an innocent woman, destroyed countless lives, all for a man who had never truly cared for her. Overwhelmed by guilt and anger, Claire stormed into Oliver's office, catching him and the unknown woman by surprise. What followed was a heated confrontation, with Claire unleashing years of pent-up pain and rage. She accused Oliver of using her, of manipulating her feelings to get rid of Taylor. Oliver, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking, didn't deny her accusations. Instead, he coldly informed Claire that she had served her purpose and was no longer needed. He threatened to expose her role in Taylor's death if she didn't disappear from his life for good. Shattered and desperate, Claire fled the office, her mind racing. She now realized the true extent of Oliver's manipulation and her own terrible mistake. As she drove home in a daze, Claire was unaware that her confrontation with Oliver had been witnessed by someone else, someone who would soon set in motion the final act of this tragic play. The woman Claire had seen with Oliver was Olivia Chen, a brilliant young lawyer who had recently joined Oliver's firm. Olivia had been drawn into an affair with Oliver, seduced by his charm and the promise of career advancement. However, unlike Claire, Olivia was not blind to Oliver's true nature. On the night of Claire's confrontation with Oliver, Olivia had hidden herself in an adjoining room, overhearing every word of their heated exchange. The revelation of Oliver's involvement in his wife's death left her cold with horror and disgust. In the days that followed, Olivia found herself grappling with a moral dilemma. She knew she should go to the police with what she had learned, but fear of professional repercussions and her own complicity in the affair held her back. As she observed Oliver continuing to play the role of the grieving widower, her revulsion grew. Determined to uncover the full truth, Olivia began her own covert investigation. She meticulously combed through Oliver's files and emails, slowly piecing together the extent of his deceit. What she discovered went far beyond Taylor's murder, revealing a pattern of fraud and manipulation that spanned years. With each new revelation, Olivia's resolve strengthened. She knew what she had to do. Armed with the evidence she had gathered, Olivia confronted Oliver in his office late one evening. She laid out everything she had discovered, from his manipulation of Claire to his fraudulent business practices. Oliver, realizing the precariousness of his situation, attempted to charm and threaten Olivia into silence. But Olivia was prepared. She had secretly recorded their entire conversation, capturing Oliver's implicit admission of guilt. As she turned to leave, intending to take her evidence to the police, Oliver snapped. In a moment of panic and rage, he attacked Olivia, attempting to wrestle the recording device from her hands. What Oliver didn't know was that Olivia, haunted by the fate of Taylor Tanner Holbrook, had come prepared. In the struggle, she managed to reach into her purse and pull out a small pistol. A shot rang out, echoing through the empty office building. Oliver Holbrook, the man who had manipulated so many, who had indirectly caused the death of his wife and the ruin of Claire Reeves crumpled to the floor. Olivia stood over him, the smoking gun still in her hand, a mix of shock and grim satisfaction on her face. As sirens wailed in the distance, Olivia calmly sat down to wait for the police. She knew that her actions would have consequences, but she also knew that the truth would finally come to light. Oliver Holbrook's reign of deception was over. The shot that killed Oliver Holbrook reverberated through Millbrook, setting off a chain reaction that would finally bring the full story of Taylor's death to light. As Olivia Chen was taken into custody, the true extent of Oliver's manipulations began to unravel. In the wake of Oliver Holbrook's death, the investigation into Taylor's murder took on new urgency. Detective Montague, armed with the evidence Olivia had gathered, began to piece together the full picture of events that had transpired over the past year. Claire Reeves, racked with guilt and fear, finally broke down under questioning. She confessed to her role in Taylor's death, providing a detailed account of her actions and motivations. Her testimony painted a damning picture of Oliver's manipulation and the extent to which he had orchestrated the events leading to his wife's murder. Claire, having confessed to Taylor's murder, was sentenced to life in prison. Olivia's case was more complex. She was convicted of manslaughter but received a reduced sentence due to the circumstances surrounding Oliver's death. The tragic tale of Oliver Holbrook, Taylor Tanner, Claire Reeves, and Olivia Chen would be remembered for years to come, a somber reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most picturesque surfaces.